close your eyes and let your mind drift as we journey through the hidden shadows of the Pokemon world. From forgotten entries in ancient Pokédexes to stories that linger just beyond the light, these quiet details will guide you into peaceful sleep. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the mysteries carry you gently into dreams. When you think of Pokemon, images of adventure and friendship probably fill your mind, creatures battling alongside trainers in a world of wonder and discovery. But beneath that surface, woven into the fabric of every region, there exist threads of something darker, stories that don't quite fit the cheerful narrative we remember from childhood. And the best place to start is where the very first shadows appeared, where a small hidden detail sits quietly in the code of the earliest games, waiting to be noticed by those who look closely enough. In the original Pokemon Red and Green versions, released in Japan, players could encounter something unusual in Lavender Town, a place already unsettling with its somber music and ghost-filled tower. The town itself was designed as a memorial to departed Pokemon, a graveyard where trainers came to pay respects to companions who had passed away. This concept alone pushed boundaries for a game marketed to children, introducing the uncomfortable reality that these creatures, these friends, could actually die. The developers chose specific musical frequencies for Lavender Town's theme, high-pitched tones that created an atmosphere of unease, notes that seemed to resonate differently in younger ears than in adult ones. Some players reported headaches after prolonged exposure to the music, though whether this was psychosomatic or genuinely physiological remains debated to this day. The tower standing at Lavender Town's center held its own mysteries, floors upon floors of ghost Pokemon and morning trainers. On the top floor, players encountered something that defied the usual Pokemon logic, a ghostly sprite that couldn't be identified or captured until a special item revealed its true form. This mechanic introduced the idea that not everything in the Pokemon world could be immediately understood or controlled, that some mysteries required specific knowledge or tools to unravel. The ghost turned out to be a Marowak, a mother Pokemon killed while defending her child from Team Rocket, forever bound to the location of her death. Here was a Pokemon that couldn't be caught or befriended, couldn't be added to your team or healed at a center, existing only as a permanent reminder of loss and injustice. The implications of this story rippled through the narrative in subtle ways. Somewhere in Lavender Town, a young Cubone wore its mother's skull, carrying the physical reminder of trauma with it everywhere. The Pokédex entries for Cubone described it as a lonely creature that cried for its departed mother, tears staining the bone it wore as a helmet. This wasn't the cheerful world of friendship and adventure anymore. This was grief made tangible, a child mourning a parent in a way that felt uncomfortably real despite the fantasy setting. And before sleep pulls you deeper tonight, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle stories like this, and tell me where you're listening from as the night settles around you. Moving beyond Lavender Town, other Pokédex entries began revealing darker truths about the creatures trainers carried in their pockets. Gengar, the popular ghost-type Pokémon, had entries suggesting it hid in shadows to drain the warmth from passers-by, causing the temperature to suddenly drop by 10 degrees. Some entries went further, implying that Gengar sought to take lives by pretending to be a person's shadow, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For a creature that many young trainers kept on their teams, battling alongside it through gym challenges and Elite Four encounters, this painted a disturbing picture of what these Pokemon truly were beneath their friendly exterior. Drifloon offered another unsettling example, a balloon-like Pokemon that seemed innocent enough at first glance. But its Pokédex entries revealed a sinister purpose. It grabbed children by the hand and attempted to drag them away to the afterlife. The entries mentioned that it preferred targeting children specifically, making it not just dangerous, but deliberately predatory in a way that felt deeply wrong. Parents in the Pokemon world would need to warn their kids about floating balloons the same way parents in our world might warn about strangers, creating an atmosphere of fear around something that should have been whimsical and fun. Phantump and Trevenant continued this theme of children meeting tragic ends. Phantump was described as the spirit of a child who became lost in the forest and never found their way home, possessing a tree stump and wandering the woods eternally. Trevenant was similarly connected to forest spirits, but with an added layer of vengeance, attacking those who harmed trees and trapping them in the forest forever. These weren't just ghost stories, they were cautionary tales embedded in the Pokédex, suggesting that the Pokemon world held real dangers for children who wandered too far from safety. Yamask carried perhaps the most explicitly disturbing backstory of any Pokemon. Its Pokédex entries stated plainly that Yamask was a human spirit, someone who had died and been transformed into this ghost-type creature. Each Yamask carried a mask representing the face they had in life. Looking at it sometimes caused them to cry, as they remembered being human. This blurred the line between Pokemon and people in ways that raised uncomfortable questions about consciousness, transformation, and whether death in this world meant something different than we understood. If humans could become Pokemon, what did that mean for the relationship between trainers and their teams? Were some Pokemon actually transformed humans, aware of what they had lost? The Pokédex entries for Banette suggested even darker possibilities about the origin of ghost Pokemon. Banette was described as a discarded plush toy that came to life, filled with hatred for the child who abandoned it. It sought out that child specifically, harboring grudges and plotting revenge for being thrown away. This introduced the concept of Pokemon born from negative emotions, creatures that existed because of human cruelty or neglect. A child's toy became a vessel for pure resentment, wandering until it could exact some form of retribution for the abandonment it suffered. Mimikyu represented a different kind of tragedy, a Pokemon so desperate for affection that it disguised itself as Pikachu, hoping to be loved the way that popular species was. Underneath its crude costume was a form so horrifying that anyone who saw it was struck with a mysterious illness, some entries suggesting they died of shock. Mimikyu knew it was hideous, knew it could never be accepted for what it truly was, and so it hid beneath a disguise, forever pretending to be something more lovable. The loneliness embedded in that existence felt almost unbearable when you stopped to consider it fully. Cubone's story extended beyond just the Lavender Town incident. Every single Cubone in existence wore the skull of its dead mother, suggesting that maternal death was not an isolated tragedy, but a species-wide phenomenon. The Pokédex never explained why Cubone mothers died so consistently, leaving players to imagine what kind of world would produce such a pattern. Did Cubone mothers sacrifice themselves during childbirth? Were they hunted by predators? The game offered no answers, only the repeated image of orphaned children carrying their mother's bones. The evolution of Cubone into Marowak carried its own implications about processing grief. Marowak was described as having overcome its sadness, growing strong by accepting its mother's death and moving forward. But the skull remained, a permanent fixture that couldn't be removed, suggesting that even acceptance didn't erase the trauma. The evolution represented maturity through suffering, strength built on the foundation of loss that could never be fully healed or forgotten. Spoink provided a more immediate form of danger, a Pokemon whose life depended on continuous bouncing. Its Pokédex entries stated that if Spoink stopped bouncing, its heart would stop beating and it would die. This created a nightmarish scenario where rest meant death, where a Pokemon could never truly relax or sleep without risking its life. Trainers who caught Spoink would need to ensure it never stopped moving, creating a responsibility that bordered on cruel given the impossibility of maintaining eternal vigilance. Shedinja emerged from a stranger concept altogether, a Pokemon created as a discarded shell when Nincada evolved into Ninjask. The hollow exoskeleton somehow gained life and sentience, becoming a separate creature with its own consciousness. Shedinja's Pokédex entries warned that looking into the hole in its back would cause your soul to be stolen, killing you instantly. This Pokemon was essentially a death trap, dangerous to anyone who approached it from the wrong angle, existing as a byproduct of evolution rather than through any natural birth. Gorobus and Huntail represented the ocean's darker aspects, creatures that lived in the deep sea, where sunlight never reached. Gorobus was described as draining bodily fluids from prey using its thin mouth, leaving behind dried husks of what were once living creatures. Huntail simply swallowed prey whole with its massive jaw, its body designed to withstand the crushing pressure of ocean depths. These weren't friendly Pokemon who battled alongside trainers in wholesome competition. They were predators in the truest sense, killing to survive in an environment hostile to most life. Sharpedo earned the nickname Bully of the Sea through its aggressive nature and razor-sharp teeth. Its Pokédex entries described it attacking ships, tearing through holes with ease and causing vessels to sink. Swimmers who encountered Sharpedo in open water rarely lived to tell the tale, as the Pokémon struck with incredible speed and devastating force. The ocean in the Pokémon world was clearly not a safe place for humans, filled with creatures that viewed people as prey rather than friends. Tyranitar's destructive power was so great that its Pokédex entries described it leveling entire mountains just by walking around. A single Tyranitar could reshape geography, destroying habitats and ecosystems without even trying. The entries mentioned that Tyranitar would wander in search of opponents to fight, demolishing everything in its path during these journeys. Towns and cities built near mountains would live in constant fear that a Tyranitar might decide to pass through, knowing that nothing they built could withstand the creature's casual rampage. Gyarados represented uncontrollable rage given physical form, a Pokemon that could burn entire cities with its fury. Once Gyarados began rampaging, it wouldn't stop until everything around it was reduced to ashes, its anger sustaining itself and growing stronger as destruction spread. The transformation from pathetic Magikarp to terrifying Gyarados served as a reminder that weakness could hide future danger, that the seemingly harmless could become catastrophically powerful under the right circumstances. The Pokédex entry for Houndoom introduced a particularly cruel element to its fire attacks. Burns from Houndoom's flames would never heal, causing eternal pain to anyone unlucky enough to be struck. This wasn't just damage, it was permanent suffering inflicted with every battle, every encounter. Trainers who used Houndoom had to accept that they were employing a Pokemon capable of causing lifelong agony to opponents, a moral weight that the games never really addressed. Litwick and its evolutions presented themselves as helpful guides, offering light in dark places to lost travelers. But the Pokédex revealed the sinister truth behind this apparent kindness. Litwick absorbed life energy from those who followed its flame, slowly draining people until they died. The Pokémon used human souls as fuel to keep its flame burning, making every act of guidance simultaneously an act of predation. Travelers who gratefully followed Litwick's light were unknowingly walking toward their own deaths. Lament haunted hospitals, according to its entries, waiting near people who were close to death so it could absorb their departing spirits. This created the image of ghost Pokemon lurking in medical facilities, invisible observers marking which patients would soon die, and positioning themselves to feast on the released souls. The thought of dying while one of these creatures hovered nearby, waiting to consume what remained of your consciousness, added a layer of horror to what should have been a place of healing. Chandelure completed the evolutionary line with perhaps the darkest entry of all. It burned spirits that it had absorbed as fuel for its flames. This wasn't just absorption, it was active destruction of souls, using consciousness itself as an energy source. People who died near Chandelure didn't just cease to exist, they were consumed and burned, their very essence turned into fuel for this Pokemon's eternal flame. Parasect told a story of complete bodily takeover, a Pokemon that had been consumed by the mushroom growing on its back. The original Paras had evolved into Parasect, but the evolution came at a terrible cost. The mushroom took full control of the host body, using it as a puppet. The bug Pokemon itself was essentially dead, its consciousness replaced by the fungus that now directed all movement and action. Trainers who used Parasect were technically commanding a zombie, a hollowed-out shell piloted by a parasitic plant. Glali formed by freezing its prey alive, encasing them in ice to store for later consumption. The Pokédex described Glali's rock-hard body of ice containing multiple frozen victims, preserved in their final moments of terror. The image of prey trapped inside Glali, still technically alive but frozen and aware, waiting to be slowly consumed, painted a picture of prolonged suffering that felt especially cruel. Guzzlord represented pure consumption, a Pokemon whose entire existence revolved around eating. Its Pokédex entries mentioned that despite its massive appetite, no one had ever seen in Guzzlord produce waste, leading to speculation about where everything it consumed actually went. Some entries suggested Guzzlord might be connected to another dimension, that it was eating our world and transferring matter elsewhere. A single Guzzlord could potentially consume an entire building, then move on to the next without ever stopping to rest. Beware showed that even Pokemon with cute appearances could be deadly. Its Pokédex entries warned that Beware loved to hug people, but its strength was so overwhelming that these affectionate embraces would crush bones and snap spines. Beware didn't mean harm, it simply didn't understand its own power, making it dangerous in a different way than aggressive Pokemon. Death by enthusiastic hugging felt almost more disturbing than death by intentional attack. Mariani actively preyed on Corsola, tearing off the coral Pokemon's branches and consuming them. The Pokédex described Mariani as specifically targeting Corsola, seeking them out and attacking them despite other food sources being available. This created a predator-prey relationship between two Pokemon species, suggesting that the Pokemon world had complex food chains where certain creatures existed primarily to be eaten by others. Galarian Corsola took this dynamic to a darker place, transforming the previously cheerful coral Pokemon into a ghost type. The entries explained that Galarian Corsola were Corsola that had died due to sudden climate change, their spirits remaining in their bleached coral bodies. These weren't just ghost Pokemon, they were explicitly the ghosts of creatures killed by environmental destruction, wandering the ocean as permanent reminders of ecological catastrophe. Esper contained psychic power so intense that it had to maintain constant control to prevent releasing it. The Pokemon lived in a state of perpetual restraint, using all its mental energy to keep its psychic abilities from exploding outward. If Esper's concentration ever slipped, the released psychic power could erase the minds of everyone nearby, leaving them as empty shells without personality or consciousness. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The concept of Pokemon graves appeared throughout various games, not just in Lavender Town. Ancient burial grounds dotted the landscape, places where people had laid their Pokemon companions to rest thousands of years ago. These sites suggested that the bond between humans and Pokemon extended back to prehistory, and that saying goodbye to deceased partners had always been part of that relationship. The games treated these graves with reverence, often blocking progress until players showed proper respect. Mount Pier in Hoenn served a similar function to Lavender Tower, another mountain dedicated to memorializing departed Pokemon. The peak held a sacred flame that burned eternally, tended by caretakers who devoted their lives to honoring the dead. Trainers climbed Mount Pyre to pay respects, to remember companions who had fallen, and the mountain's quiet atmosphere encouraged reflection on the inevitable end that awaited all living things. Spiritomb offered one of the most explicitly dark origin stories in the entire Pokédex. It was formed from 108 spirits, bound together and sealed in a stone through ancient ritual. These weren't willing participants in some mystical fusion. They were trapped, forced into a collective existence they couldn't escape. The number 108 held significance in Buddhist tradition, representing earthly desires and sins, suggesting that these spirits were specifically chosen for their wicked nature. The old chateau in Sinnoh provided environmental storytelling that hinted at tragedy without explicit explanation. The abandoned mansion held ghost Pokemon in every room, with occasional glimpses of a ghostly butler and young girl appearing in windows. Players could encounter these spirits, but never interact with them, the phantoms simply existing as reminders that this place had seen death. The journal entries scattered throughout suggested a family that had once lived there, but what happened to them remained deliberately vague. Rotom inhabited the old chateau as well, a ghost Pokemon that possessed electrical appliances. One journal entry described a Pokemon making the motor run, hinting at Rotom's presence even before the player encountered it. The implication that this ghost had been in the mansion for years, perhaps decades, possessing various objects and watching as the building fell into decay, created a sense of lonely haunting that permeated the location. N's room in Team Plasma's castle revealed a childhood marked by isolation and manipulation. The room contained a single bed, a few toys, and drawings on the wall depicting Pokemon in cages. N had been raised from birth to believe humans hurt Pokemon, kept separate from normal society, and fed a steady diet of abused Pokemon to reinforce this worldview. His entire identity had been shaped by Ghetsis' manipulation, making him a victim even as he stood as the game's primary antagonist. The theory that N was raised alongside Pokemon who had been deliberately hurt to teach him specific lessons painted an even darker picture. Ghetsis would have needed to ensure a steady supply of abused Pokemon to maintain the illusion, meaning Team Plasma might have been actively harming Pokemon specifically to condition N's beliefs. Every Pokemon N encountered as a child was traumatized, creating a worldview where kindness seemed impossible. Lucamine's obsession with Ultra Beasts in Pokemon Sun and Moon stemmed from deep trauma and mental instability. After her husband disappeared into an Ultra wormhole, she became fixated on preserving beauty and perfection, eventually going so far as to freeze Pokemon in ice to keep them pristine forever. Her collection of frozen Pokemon lined the walls of her mansion, each one perfectly preserved but completely dead, transformed from living creatures into decorative objects. The scene where Lucamine fused with an Ultra Beast represented a complete break from sanity, a mother who had lost herself so thoroughly in obsession that she became something inhuman. Her children watched as she transformed, calling them worthless and declaring her love for the Ultra Beasts above all else. The battle against this fusion felt less like fighting a villain and more like trying to stop someone in the grips of a psychotic episode. Guzma's backstory revealed abuse and failure as the foundation of his villainous turn. His room in his parents' house showed broken furniture and holes in walls, evidence of violent outbursts stemming from his father's expectations. Guzma had tried to become a trial captain, failed, and returned home to face disappointment and punishment. Team Skull formed from this rejection, a gathering of failures who found belonging in their shared experience of not measuring up. The connection between Guzma and Lusamine took on sinister undertones when examined closely. She manipulated him, used his desperation for validation to make him follow her plans. When she discarded him after getting what she needed, calling him worthless, it echoed the rejection he had experienced his entire life. Guzma ended the story broken and confused, another victim in Lusamine's wake. Lily's journey centered on escaping her mother's control and finding her own identity. She had been dressed in elaborate clothes that Lusamine chose, forced to maintain a perfect appearance at all times. Her eventual decision to change her outfit and leave Alola represented breaking free from abuse, but the game made clear this was only the beginning of a long healing process. The trauma would stay with her. The reveal that Type, Null, was created by Faba through painful experimentation showed how far the Ether Foundation had fallen from its stated mission. These synthetic Pokemon were designed to be weapons against Ultra Beasts, built from parts of multiple Pokemon and forced into a form their bodies rejected. The helmet bolted to Type, Null's head suppressed its power, but also caused constant pain, a control mask that couldn't be removed without intensive care. Silvali's existence proved that Type, Null, could evolve, but only through developing a strong bond with a trainer. The evolution represented trust, overcoming trauma, the Pokemon finally accepting kindness after a life of experimentation. But the fact remained that Silvally started as a weapon, created through suffering, and that origin couldn't be erased no matter how much love it eventually received. The Ultra Beasts themselves existed as creatures ripped from their home dimensions, confused and dangerous in a world they didn't understand. Pheromosa was described as viewing everything in Alola as filthy, constantly disgusted by its surroundings. Celesteela couldn't control its size or power, posing a threat simply by existing near populated areas. These weren't evil creatures, they were victims of circumstance, lost in a place where they didn't belong. Necrozma's backstory revealed in Ultrasun and Ultramoon painted it as a creature in constant agony. Once a being of light that illuminated an entire dimension, Necrozma had been wounded and lost most of its body. The pain of this injury drove it to seek light desperately, consuming it wherever possible to ease the suffering. The creature's aggression stemmed from an eternity of hurt, making it more tragic than villainous. The scene where Necrozma absorbed Nebby played as body horror, the small cosmog consumed and used as an energy source while fully conscious. Players who had raised a Nebby throughout the game watched helplessly as their companion was imprisoned and drained, unable to intervene. The rescue felt too late, occurring only after Necrozma had already taken what it needed. The burned tower in Johto held its own dark legend, a structure that had caught fire centuries ago and taken 3 Pokemon with it. According to myth, these 3 died in the flames, but were resurrected by Ho-Oh as the legendary beasts Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The process of resurrection changed them fundamentally, transforming them into entirely different species. What died in that tower were not the same creatures that emerged. This raised questions about death and resurrection in the Pokemon world. If Ho-Oh could bring Pokemon back to life, were they truly restored or simply replaced with new beings that inherited the memories of the deceased? The legendary beasts roamed Johto eternally, never stopping to rest, as if driven by some compulsion born from their traumatic rebirth. The theory that the legendary beasts were originally Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon gave names to the 3 who died in the burned tower. These had been someone's companions once, beloved partners who perished in a tragedy beyond anyone's control. Ho-Oh's intervention saved them from permanent death, but stripped away their identities, leaving them as powerful but fundamentally altered versions of what they had been. Mewtwo's creation story formed the backbone of the first Pokemon movie and established themes that would echo through the franchise. Scientists had found Mew's DNA and used it to create a more powerful version, caring nothing for the ethics of creating artificial life. Mewtwo gained consciousness in a laboratory, surrounded by machinery and researchers who viewed it as a product rather than a being. The moment Mewtwo became aware raised questions that the movie never fully answered. How long had it been conscious before scientists realized? Had it spent days, weeks, or months aware but unable to communicate, trapped in a tank while researchers conducted experiments? The trauma of that awakening shaped everything that followed. Mewtwo's question about its purpose, who am I? Why am I here? Resonated because it was genuinely lost, created without parents or history, designed only to be powerful. Mewtwo had no frame of reference for understanding its existence. The movie framed this as an existential crisis, but it was really the cry of a confused child trying to understand why it had been brought into a world that immediately treated it as a weapon. The realization that humans intended to use it for battling and entertainment filled Mewtwo with rage. It had been created as a tool, its consciousness an unexpected byproduct rather than the goal. The scientists celebrated their success in making a powerful Pokemon while never considering whether that Pokemon might have feelings about its situation. Mewtwo's destruction of the laboratory that created it played as revenge but also as a necessary cutting of ties. As long as that place existed, Mewtwo would be connected to its origin as a product, something manufactured rather than born. The explosion severed that connection violently, establishing Mewtwo as a being who would define itself rather than accept the definition imposed by creators. The movie's climax involved Mewtwo creating clones of the trainer's Pokemon, attempting to prove that cloned life was superior to natural life. But the clones fought their originals in brutal combat that served no purpose beyond Mewtwo's need to validate its existence. Watching Pokemon attack their copies while trainers screamed for them to stop created a scene of pointless violence born from philosophical confusion. Amber's story appeared only in Japanese versions of the first movie, providing context for Mewtwo's emotional capacity. The daughter of one of the scientists had died, and her father had attempted to clone her alongside Mewtwo. In Mewtwo's earliest memories, Amber existed as a psychic presence, another consciousness developing in the laboratory. They had communicated before either gained physical form, making her Mewtwo's first and only friend. But Amber's clone failed to stabilize. Mewtwo witnessed her consciousness fade and disappear, experiencing death and loss before it had even been born. This trauma imprinted deeply, giving Mewtwo an understanding of mortality that shaped its later philosophy about the value of life. The removal of this subplot from international releases weakened Mewtwo's characterization, reducing its motivations to simple anger. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town contained graves for thousands of Pokemon, a physical reminder that death touched this world constantly. Trainers came to mourn companions, leaving flowers and standing in silence before headstones. The game encouraged players to show respect, punishing those who ran through the tower or treated it carelessly with increased wild encounters. The Marowak ghost in the tower couldn't be fought or captured, could only be laid to rest by revealing its true form and listening to its story. This ghost had a specific identity, a mother who died protecting her child, and the game honored that by making players acknowledge what happened before allowing progress. You couldn't ignore this death, couldn't move forward without bearing witness. The orphaned Cubone that appeared after its mother's spirit was laid to rest carried its trauma visibly. Players could catch this Cubone and add it to their team, but doing so meant taking responsibility for a deeply wounded creature. The Pokédex reminded you constantly that Cubone cried for its mother, that it was lonely and sad, making every battle a reminder of what this Pokemon had lost. The question of whether catching the orphaned Cubone was kind or cruel remained unanswered. On one hand, it gave the Pokemon a new family and purpose. On the other hand, it separated Cubone from the place where its mother died, removing it from the last connection to its past. The game left this moral ambiguity in place, trusting players to make their own judgment. Mount Pyre in Hoenn expanded the concept of Pokemon graves beyond a single tower. The entire mountain was sacred, dedicated to honoring departed Pokemon across generations. The elderly caretakers who tended the memorial flame had devoted their entire lives to this purpose, seeing it as holy work that couldn't be abandoned. And Team Magma and Team Aqua's raid on Mount Pyre to steal orbs represented a violation of sacred space. The game made clear that this wasn't just theft, but desecration, disturbing the resting place of thousands of Pokemon for selfish gain. The caretakers couldn't fight back effectively, could only plead with the teams to leave, making the theft feel even more wrong. The red and blue orbs, stolen from Mount Pyre, had been placed there specifically to prevent their misuse. Ancient people understood these artifacts' power and chose to house them in a place of death and respect, hoping the sacred atmosphere would deter those who might use them recklessly. Team Magma and Team Aqua's willingness to defile a memorial proved they lacked the wisdom to wield what they sought. The awakening of Groudon and Kyogre resulted directly from disturbing Mount Pyre's relics. The catastrophic weather patterns that followed, the droughts and floods that threatened to destroy Hoenn, could be traced back to that moment of disrespect. The game connected environmental disaster to spiritual violation, suggesting that some boundaries existed for good reason. The Ghost Girl in Lumiose City became one of the most discussed Easter eggs in Pokemon history. Players riding the elevator in one building would occasionally encounter a scene where the screen went dark, a ghostly figure appeared, and a voice said, "No, you're not the one." The elevator then returned to normal, leaving players confused about what they had witnessed. The deliberate ambiguity of this encounter created more fear than any concrete explanation could have. Who was the ghost girl? What was she looking for? Why did she appear in a random office building elevator? The game provided no answers, no follow-up, just a brief moment of supernatural contact that defied explanation. Theories about the ghost girl ranged from the tragic to the terrifying. Some suggested she was looking for a lost loved one, others that she was searching for someone to possess. A few proposed she was warning players about some future danger, though what that danger might be remained unclear. The lack of resolution meant each player could project their own fears onto the encounter. The Strange House in Unova took environmental storytelling to new levels of unsettling. The building sat isolated on a route, visibly decayed and surrounded by an atmosphere of wrongness. Ghost Pokemon filled every room, but more disturbing were the diary entries left behind by a girl who had once lived there. The diary told the story of a child whose only friend was a Pokemon named something that couldn't quite be made out from the deteriorated text. This Pokemon was her entire world, her companion in isolation, the only being who cared about her. The entries grew increasingly desperate, the girl writing about feeling alone and scared as her Pokemon friend became weaker. The final entries suggested the Pokemon had died, leaving the girl completely alone. The last legible words expressed a wish to see her friend again, a childish hope that somehow they could be reunited. The diary ended there with no indication of what happened to the girl herself. Exploring the strange house further revealed a lunar wing hidden in the building, an item connected to the legendary Pokemon Cresselia. The implication seemed to be that the girl had been suffering from nightmares, possibly induced by Darkrai, and the lunar wing was somehow involved in her story, but the exact connection remained frustratingly vague. The prevailing theory suggested the ghost girl encountered in the strange house was the same child from the diary. She had died alone after her Pokemon companion passed away, and her spirit remained in the house, still looking for her lost friend. The Lunar Wing's presence hinted that nightmares might have played a role in the tragedy, but whether they caused the deaths or simply tormented the dying was unclear. Meeting the ghost girl in the strange house triggered no battle or significant event. She simply appeared, looked at the player, and vanished. This restraint made the encounter more effective than a scripted scare would have been. The girl was just there, existing in her eternal loneliness, unable or unwilling to communicate beyond her presence. The player's role in the strange house felt uncomfortably voyeuristic. You were reading a dead child's diary, walking through her home, witnessing her loneliness and grief without consent. The game made no attempt to justify this invasion of privacy, leaving players to wrestle with the ethics of exploring a tragedy for items and experience points. The connection between loneliness and ghost-type Pokemon appeared repeatedly throughout the series. Shuppet fed on negative emotions, particularly grudges and envy. Duskull watched children specifically, drawn to their crying. Miss Drevis loved to startle people and feed on their fear. These Pokemon existed in relationship to human suffering, sustained by emotions that arose from pain and isolation. This suggested that ghost Pokemon might actually need human misery to survive, that they depended on tragedy the way other Pokemon depended on habitats or food sources. A world without suffering might be a world where ghost types couldn't exist, creating a perverse situation where these Pokemon benefited from the same traumas that damaged humans. The question of whether ghost Pokemon caused the suffering they fed on or simply took advantage of naturally occurring pain remained unresolved. Shuppet was attracted to grudges, but did it encourage those grudges to deepen? Misdreavus scared people, but did it create situations where people would be more easily frightened? The games hinted at answers without committing to any. Aegislash carried one of the darkest Pokédex entries for a non-legendary Pokémon. It was described as a ghost that possessed shields and swords, using them to drain the life force from those who touched it. But the truly disturbing part was the implication that Aegislash actively sought to be wielded, tempting warriors and kings to take hold of it so it could feed on their energy. History in the Pokemon world was filled with references to Aegislash and Honage being responsible for the deaths of kings and military leaders. And these weren't accidents or unfortunate side effects. The Pokemon actively manipulated people into positions where it could drain them. Entire dynasties had fallen because rulers picked up a cursed sword that looked like salvation but brought only ruin. The idea that a Pokemon might deliberately seek to harm humans for its own benefit challenged the fundamental premise of the franchise. Pokemon were supposed to be partners, friends, creatures that coexisted with humanity in generally positive ways. Aegislash represented a darker possibility that some Pokemon viewed humans as resources to be exploited or prey to be consumed. Trainers who caught Aegislash and used it in battle had to wonder whether they were controlling the Pokemon or whether it was allowing itself to be used while slowly feeding on them. Every command given, every battle fought, could be part of Aegislash's patient plan to drain its trainer completely. The game never addressed this tension, leaving it as an unsettling possibility. Cofagrigus took the concept of Pokemon mimicry in a sinister direction. It disguised itself as an ornate coffin, waiting for grave robbers or archaeologists to approach. When someone got close enough, Cofagrigus would spring its trap, imprisoning them inside its body and transforming them into mummies. The Pokédex described these victims as being eternally preserved, conscious but unable to escape or die. The horror of being trapped inside Cofagrigus couldn't be overstated. You would be aware of your situation, able to think and feel, but completely unable to move or communicate. Time would pass around you while you remained frozen, watching through the Pokemon's eyes as it moved through the world seeking more victims. Centuries could go by in this state. The question of what happened to consciousness during this imprisonment went unanswered. Did the trapped people eventually lose their minds from sensory deprivation? Did they find some way to sleep, to drift into unconsciousness? Or did they remain fully aware for potentially thousands of years, experiencing every moment of their captivity with pristine clarity? Cofagrigus used the bodies of its victims as power sources, drawing energy from their trapped life force. This created a perverse ecosystem where the Pokemon needed to keep capturing people to sustain itself, but keeping them alive-ish meant it could drain them slowly over time. Each Cofagrigus carried potentially dozens of mummified victims inside it, layered on top of each other like sediment. The archaeological implications of Cofagrigus were staggering. How many missing persons throughout history had simply been captured by these Pokemon? How many tombs held Cofagrigus instead of actual sarcophagi, leading to archaeologists accidentally releasing them? The Pokemon world's version of archaeology would need to account for the possibility that ancient ruins might actively fight back. Palossand represented a similar threat in beach environments. This Pokemon disguised itself as a sand castle, something children would naturally be drawn to. When kids got close enough to play with what they thought was an abandoned creation, Palossand would trap them inside its body, slowly draining their life force over time. The image of children being absorbed into a sandcastle, their bodies becoming part of its structure, ranked among the most disturbing visuals suggested by any Pokédex entry. Parents would need to warn kids not to touch sandcastles left by other children, creating an atmosphere of paranoia around what should have been innocent beach fun. Palossand's shovel worked as a lure, positioned to look like someone had left it behind. Children would pick up the shovel to help build the castle, and that contact would allow Palossand to begin draining them. The Pokemon showed genuine strategy in its predation, using human psychology and childhood instincts against victims. The spirits of those absorbed by Palossand supposedly strengthened it, their life energy becoming part of the Pokemon's power. This meant that every Palossand encountered might contain the remains of multiple children, their essence trapped forever in sand and malice. The beach became another place where Pokemon posed existential threats to humans. Decidueye's entry in Pokemon Moon described it as being able to shoot arrows at prey from half a mile away, never missing. This precision came from the Pokemon's ability to sense life force, meaning it could target living things even through walls or cover. There was no hiding from Decidueye, no way to escape once it decided you were prey. The question of what Decidueye hunted went carefully unanswered by the Pokédex. It mentioned prey, but never specified what qualified as food. In a world where the line between Pokemon and people was already uncomfortably blurred, the possibility that Decidueye might view humans as legitimate targets couldn't be dismissed. The evolution from Rowlet, a cheerful round owl, to Decidueye, a precision killer, marked one of the darkest transformations in the series. That cute starter Pokemon players chose at the beginning became something genuinely dangerous, a reminder that power came with implications that the games usually avoided addressing directly. Decidueye's ability to remain completely silent while moving made it the perfect assassin. Victims wouldn't hear it approach, wouldn't know they were being hunted until the arrow had already been fired. The Pokédex mentioned the stealth admiringly, as if it were a positive trait rather than a deeply unsettling one. The relationship between trainers and their Decidueye raised questions the game didn't want to answer. Could the Pokemon be trusted not to hunt people? Did it understand the difference between legitimate prey and protected beings? Or did trainers simply hope their bond was strong enough that Decidui would choose not to exercise its full capabilities? Mimikyu's true form beneath its costume was so horrible that the one documented person who saw it died of shock. The Pokédex stated this plainly, not as speculation, but as verified fact. Someone had lifted Mimikyu's disguise, seen what lay underneath, and the sight alone stopped their heart. This made Mimikyu potentially one of the most dangerous Pokemon in existence. The tragic element came from Mimikyu's awareness of its own hideousness. It knew people would react with horror if they saw its real appearance, so it hid beneath a crude Pikachu costume in hopes of being loved. But the costume fooled no one. Other Pokemon and humans alike recognized Mimikyu as something trying to disguise itself, creating a situation where the attempt to be loved actually prevented any genuine connection. Mimikyu's jealousy of Pikachu stemmed from seeing a Pokemon that looked somewhat similar receiving all the affection Mimikyu desperately wanted. If Pikachu could be loved for being small and vaguely shaped like Mimikyu was shaped under the costume, why couldn't Mimikyu receive the same acceptance? The disguise represented an attempt to achieve that same love through imitation, but the costume itself was falling apart, poorly made from whatever materials Mimikyu could scavenge. The drawn-on face looked more sad than cute. The fabric was ragged and torn. The whole effect was unsettling rather than endearing. Even Mimikyu's attempt to be lovable came across as disturbing, ensuring it would never achieve its goal. The few trainers who caught Mimikyu had to constantly wonder what they were actually training. The Pokemon beneath the costume remained a mystery, its true form and capabilities unknown. Every battle, every moment of companionship occurred through layers of cloth and lies, preventing any authentic relationship from developing. Froslass's origin came from women who died while lost in mountains during snowstorms. Their spirits possessed ice and snow, becoming Pokemon in death. This transformation suggested that dying in specific ways or specific locations could turn humans into Pokemon, blurring the line between species in ways that raised uncomfortable questions about consciousness and identity. If a woman became Froslass after freezing to death, did she retain her memories of being human? Did she remember her life, her family, the circumstances that led to her death? Or did the transformation erase those connections, leaving only instincts and the vague awareness that she had once been something different? The Pokédex entries for Froslass mentioned it preferring to freeze men and add them to its collection. This gendered violence suggested these ghost Pokemon carried grudges from their human lives, possibly blaming men for the circumstances of their deaths. Freezing and collecting male victims represented a form of revenge for whatever tragedy had left them to die in the snow. The frozen men in Froslass's collection were described as being displayed in the Pokemon's lair, preserved as decorations or trophies. This created the image of an ice cave filled with frozen corpses, each one posed and arranged according to Froslass's preferences. The horror wasn't just in the death, but in the desecration that followed. Trainers who caught Froslass had to accept that they were commanding a being created from human death, that their Pokemon had once been a person with a life and identity that ended in tragedy. The game never addressed how this knowledge should affect the trainer-Pokemon relationship, or whether it was ethical to use such a being for battles. Runerigus formed from an ancient clay tablet painted with a specific curse. The tablet absorbed a wandering spirit, trapping it in an artifact that then became a Pokemon. This suggested that objects could become Pokemon under the right circumstances, that the boundaries between item and creature were more fluid than they appeared. The spirit trapped in Runerigus had no choice in its transformation. One moment it was a ghost, the next it was bound to clay, forced into a form it didn't choose. The curse painted on the tablet ensured the spirit couldn't escape, creating an eternal prison that moved and battled but offered no freedom. The question of whose spirit was trapped in each Runerigus went unanswered. Were these random ghosts or specific individuals targeted by the curse? Did different Runerigus contain different spirits with different histories? The game treated them as interchangeable monsters rather than unique beings with individual stories. Yamask's mask represented the face the person had worn in life, a literal piece of their human identity carried into death. The Pokédex mentioned that Yamask sometimes looked at this mask and cried, overwhelmed by memories of being human. This moment of recognition and grief suggested these Pokemon retained full awareness of what they had lost. The transformation from human to Yamask appeared to happen at the moment of death, spirits immediately manifesting as ghost Pokemon rather than moving to any afterlife. This raised theological questions about what death meant in the Pokemon world. Was there no heaven or hell, only transformation into another form of existence? Did every dead person become a ghost Pokemon? The cultural implications of Yamask were staggering. If any dead person might become a Yamask, then every ghost Pokemon encountered could potentially be someone's deceased relative. Trainers catching and battling with Yamask might unknowingly be commanding the spirits of people who had recently died, forcing them to fight for entertainment. Kofagrigus, the evolved form of Yamask, seemed to lose the connection to its human past. The mask was no longer visible, absorbed into the coffin body. This suggested that evolution for ghost Pokemon meant moving further from human identity, letting go of memories and personality in favor of becoming more fully Pokemon. But this raised the question of whether evolution was desirable for Yamask. If it meant losing the last connection to their human life, permanently severing ties to who they had been, would a Yamask want to evolve? The game forced this evolution through normal leveling mechanics, not giving the Pokemon a choice in whether to retain its humanity or abandon it. The relationship between humans and ghost-type Pokemon in the ancient past suggested even darker practices than what modern trainers experienced. Archaeological sites throughout various regions revealed murals depicting rituals where humans deliberately created ghost Pokemon through sacrifice and ceremony, transforming living beings into spectral servants bound to serve specific purposes. These weren't accidental transformations, but intentional acts, people choosing to create ghosts for power or protection or revenge. The ruins in Sinnoh contained tablets describing how ancient people would seal their enemies into stones, transforming them into Spiritomb through elaborate curse rituals. The process required gathering 108 malicious spirits, binding them together through force, and imprisoning the resulting mass in a physical anchor. The number 108 wasn't arbitrary, but represented specific sins and desires that needed to be present for the transformation to succeed. Imagine being one of those spirits, pulled from whatever afterlife existed and forced into a collective consciousness with 107 other beings. Your individual identity would dissolve into the mass, your thoughts becoming indistinguishable from the others, your agency completely removed. And this state would persist forever, sealed in stone, unable to die or escape or even properly exist. The odd keystone that served as Spiritomb's anchor wasn't unique. Archaeological evidence suggested ancient civilizations created hundreds of these keystones, each one imprisoning a different collective of spirits. Most had been lost to time, buried in ruins or crumbled to dust, but the spirits they contained presumably still existed somewhere, trapped without even the anchor to give them physical form. The fact that modern trainers could find these keystones and use the spirit Omb within them for battles raised ethical questions the games never addressed. These were imprisoned souls being forced to fight for entertainment, beings that had already suffered a transformation and eternal captivity now subjected to additional indignity. but the game treated them as just another rare Pokemon to collect and train. Dusknoir's role as a guide for lost spirits added another layer to the ghost-type ecosystem. According to its Pokédex entries, Dusknoir received messages from the spirit world through the antenna on its head, instructions about which souls needed to be collected and transported. This made Dusknoir essentially the Grim Reaper of the Pokemon world, a psychopomp that ushered the dead to whatever awaited them beyond. The disturbing implication was that Dusknoir operated according to external orders, that something or someone in the spirit world directed its actions. Who gave these commands? What intelligence existed in the afterlife that could communicate with Pokemon in the living world? The games hinted at a complex supernatural bureaucracy, but never explained its structure or purpose. Trainers who used Dusknoir in battle were essentially commanding death itself, telling a creature whose purpose involved collecting souls to fight for them instead. Did this interfere with Dusknoir's actual duties? Were their spirits waiting to be guided to the afterlife while their designated psychopomp was stuck in a trainer's Pokeball? The game mechanics didn't account for this conflict. The receiving antenna on Dusknoir's head picked up radio waves from the spirit world, translating messages from the dead into instructions the Pokemon could follow. This suggested the afterlife operated on frequencies similar to radio broadcasts, that death involved transformation into a form of energy that could be transmitted and received like any other signal. The scientific implications were staggering. If spirits could be detected as radio waves, then theoretically they could be recorded, analyzed, even manipulated using the right technology. The Pokemon world's understanding of death might be far more technical than spiritual, treating the afterlife as a dimension that could be measured and potentially accessed through scientific means rather than mystical ones. Giratina's exile to the distortion world hinted at this technical understanding of death and dimensions. The legendary Pokemon had been banished for violence, sent to an antimatter realm where physics worked differently. This wasn't hell in a religious sense, but rather a parallel dimension with inverted laws, a place that existed alongside the normal world, but reflected it in disturbing ways. The distortion world's gravity shifted based on where you stood. Surfaces became walls, and walls became floors, and time flowed differently than in the regular world. Giratina lived in this place alone, separated from all other Pokemon, serving a sentence that had already lasted thousands of years, with no indication it would ever end. The loneliness of such an existence defied comprehension. But Giratina could travel between dimensions, moving from the distortion world to the normal world through tears in reality. This meant the banishment wasn't absolute, that Giratina chose to remain in exile rather than being physically incapable of escape. Perhaps it had accepted its punishment, or perhaps it had grown so accustomed to the distortion world that the normal world no longer felt comfortable. The mirrors and reflective surfaces that served as gateways to the distortion world suggested a connection between that dimension and concepts of reversal and opposition. Everything in the distortion world inverted something from the normal world, making it a place of cosmic negation. Existing there meant being constantly surrounded by wrongness, by things that should be one way, but were instead their opposite. The spirits that allegedly inhabited the distortion world, alongside Giratina, raised questions about whether the afterlife and the antimatter dimension were connected. If ghost Pokemon came from the distortion world, then death might simply mean crossing over into that inverted realm, becoming part of its backwards physics and reverse nature. This would explain why ghost types seem to operate according to different rules than other Pokemon. Darkrai represented a different kind of horror, not death, but eternal nightmares. The Pokemon caused anyone who came near it to fall into deep sleep, filled with terrible dreams, visions so vivid and frightening that they could drive people to madness. Darkrai didn't choose this power. It simply emanated nightmare energy constantly, unable to turn off the effect or control its radius. This meant Darkrai lived in complete isolation, unable to approach other beings without causing them harm. Any Pokemon or person who got too close would immediately fall unconscious and begin experiencing horrific visions. Darkrai's entire existence was loneliness imposed by its own nature, a curse it couldn't escape or overcome. The content of Darkrai's nightmares varied based on the victim's fears and anxieties, drawing from their subconscious to create personalized horror. This made the nightmares particularly effective at causing psychological damage, as each person experienced exactly the scenarios they found most terrifying. The dreams felt real while they lasted, indistinguishable from actual events. People who experienced Darkrai's nightmares sometimes never fully recovered, carrying trauma from events that had only happened in their minds. The boundary between dream and reality blurred for these victims, leaving them uncertain about which memories could be trusted. Some withdrew from society entirely, unable to function after experiencing what felt like genuine torture. The relationship between Darkrai and Cresselia suggested a cosmic balance between nightmares and peaceful dreams. Cresselia could cure those affected by Darkrai using the Lunar Wing, an item that supposedly dispelled bad dreams and brought restful sleep. This made Cresselia the antidote to Darkrai's poison, a remedy that existed specifically to counter the nightmare Pokemon's effect. But Cresselia was far rarer than Darkrai, appearing only occasionally and to specific people. This meant most of Darkrai's victims had no access to the cure, left to suffer nightmares until they either died or went insane. The cosmic balance felt tilted towards suffering, with nightmare more accessible than relief. The theory that Darkrai wasn't inherently evil, but simply trapped by its nature, added the tragic weight to its existence. It didn't want to hurt people, didn't choose to be a nightmare generator, but had no way to stop itself. Every encounter with another being resulted in harm, making Darkrai's entire life a series of unintentional cruelties. Some stories suggested Darkrai deliberately isolated itself to protect others, choosing loneliness over causing harm. It would hide in remote locations, avoiding populated areas, suffering through solitude, because that was preferable to the alternative. This self-imposed exile made Darkrai sympathetic despite the damage it caused. Trainers who somehow caught Darkrai faced an impossible moral situation. Using the Pokemon in battle meant inflicting nightmares on opponents, causing genuine psychological harm for the sake of winning. But keeping it locked in a Pokeball meant condemning it to an even worse isolation than it already experienced. There were no good options. The move Dark Void, signature to Darkrai, put entire teams of opposing Pokemon to sleep simultaneously, filling their minds with nightmares while they were unconscious. This wasn't just a battle tactic, but psychological warfare, damaging opponents mentally while they were helpless to defend themselves. The game treated it as a normal move, just another tool in a trainer's arsenal. Mewtwo's creation involved mixing Mew's DNA with human genetic material, creating a hybrid being that was neither fully Pokemon nor fully human. This explained Mewtwo's unusual intelligence and capacity for human language, traits that set it apart from other Pokemon. But it also meant Mewtwo was fundamentally alone, the only member of its species, unable to find companionship with either humans or Pokemon. The laboratory where Mewtwo was created had attempted to make multiple clones before succeeding. These failed experiments were destroyed, their bodies disposed of before Mewtwo gained consciousness. When Mewtwo eventually learned about these earlier attempts, it had to process the knowledge that others like it had existed briefly before being killed for not meeting specifications. The scene in the first movie, where Mewtwo destroys the laboratory, was often interpreted as simple revenge, but it also served as a cremation for those failed clones. Mewtwo was burning the evidence of its creator's callousness, ensuring no record remained of the casual way they had discarded life. The explosion was both murder and memorial. Giovanni's attempt to use Mewtwo as a weapon demonstrated how the world viewed the artificial Pokemon. Despite its obvious intelligence and capacity for independent thought, Giovanni treated Mewtwo as a tool to be wielded, something that existed to serve rather than to live. This objectification drove Mewtwo's growing hatred of humanity. The armor Giovanni forced Mewtwo to wear was designed to suppress its psychic powers, keeping them focused and controlled for battle purposes. But the armor also served as a constant physical reminder of captivity, a weight that Mewtwo couldn't remove without help. Being trapped in the armor while simultaneously being forced to fight created a state of complete powerlessness. When Mewtwo finally broke free from Giovanni's control, the first thing it did was destroy the armor. The shattering of those restraints symbolized more than physical freedom. It represented Mewtwo's rejection of the role humans had assigned it. No longer would it be a weapon or a tool, it would define itself and its purpose. The clones Mewtwo created in its own image represented an attempt to build a family, to create others like itself who could understand its unique existence. But the cloning process Mewtwo used was imperfect, resulting in Pokemon that were similar to their originals, but fundamentally different. These clones would face the same questions of identity and belonging that plagued Mewtwo. The battle between originals and clones played out as philosophical argument made physical. Mewtwo believed clones were superior because they were created with purpose rather than born randomly. The original Pokemon fought to prove their lives had value, regardless of how they came into existence. Neither side could win because the question they were fighting over had no definitive answer. Watching the Pokemon battle their own copies created a disturbing spectacle where creatures fought themselves, where the violence had no purpose beyond proving an abstract point. Trainers screamed for their Pokemon to stop, but couldn't intervene, forced to watch as their companions brutalized mirror images in pursuit of validation for Mewtwo's existential crisis. The tears that eventually stopped the fighting came from both humans and Pokemon, a shared emotional response that transcended the question of origin. Mewtwo's realization that both originals and clones could cry, could feel genuine sorrow, finally broke through its rigid categorization of life into superior and inferior forms. But this revelation came too late to prevent the trauma inflicted during the battle. Pokemon had been forced to attack versions of themselves, creating psychological scars that would likely never fully heal. The physical wounds would close, but the memory of fighting your own copy would persist indefinitely. Mewtwo's departure at the end of the movie, taking the clones to a remote location where they could live in peace, felt like the only possible resolution. These beings needed separation from the world that had created and hurt them, space to exist without constant reminders of their artificial origins. The erasure of memories that concluded the film raised its own disturbing questions. Mewtwo removed all recollection of the events from the humans and Pokemon who had witnessed them, essentially rewriting reality for these beings without their consent. The power to alter memories meant the power to control truth itself. How many times had Mewtwo used this ability? How many encounters with humans had been erased from memory, leaving the affected people with gaps in their timeline they couldn't explain? The movie showed one instance, but Mewtwo's casual use of the technique suggested long practice. The ethics of memory manipulation went completely unaddressed by the film. Removing traumatic memories might seem kind, but it also removed agency, taking away people's ability to process and learn from difficult experiences. The affected beings would never know what had been taken from them, never realize they were missing pieces of their own history. Some of the Pokemon might have wanted to remember, to hold on to the experience despite its pain. The clone Pokemon certainly deserve to be remembered, to have their existence acknowledged rather than erased. By wiping everyone's memories, Mewtwo was essentially denying the clones had ever existed in the eyes of most witnesses. The long term psychological effects of having memories removed remained unexplored. Would the affected beings experience a vague sense of loss, feeling like something important had happened but unable to recall what? Would they have dreams about events they couldn't consciously remember, their subconscious trying to preserve what had been taken? Mew's role in the story as the genetic source for Mewtwo's creation made it partially responsible for the artificial Pokemon's suffering. If Mew hadn't been discovered, hadn't left behind DNA for scientists to find, Mewtwo would never have been created. But Mew showed no awareness of this connection, treating Mewtwo as just another opponent, rather than as something it had inadvertently caused. The battle between Mew and Mewtwo represented more than just original versus copy. It was a fight between natural existence and artificial creation, between the Pokemon who had always been and the one who was made. Mew fought playfully, not taking the battle seriously, which only enraged Mewtwo further. From Mewtwo's perspective, Mew's casual attitude was an insult. Here was the being whose DNA had been stolen to create Mewtwo, fighting as if the battle was a game, showing no understanding of what Mewtwo had endured. The psychological damage of having your genetic parent treat you as insignificant couldn't be overstated. Mew's apparent inability to understand suffering or take things seriously suggested a childlike consciousness, an eternal innocent who saw everything as play. This made Mew sympathetic, but also frustrating. A being with immense power, but no real comprehension of consequences or responsibility. The question of whether Mewtwo was created from its DNA remained unanswered. Did Mew comprehend genetics and cloning, or did it simply see another powerful Pokemon to fight? The intellectual gap between them might be wider than the emotional one. Arceus's position as the creator of the Pokemon universe made it responsible for all the suffering within that creation. Every tragedy, every death, every moment of pain could be traced back to Arceus's decision to create existence in the first place. This raised theological questions about whether creation was inherently good if it included such capacity for harm. The Pokédex entries described Arceus shaping the universe from chaos, creating Dialga to control time, Palkia to control space, and Giratina to govern antimatter. But these weren't collaborators. They were tools Arceus made to serve specific functions. The legendary Pokemon had no choice in their roles, born into cosmic responsibility they never requested. Dialga's control over time meant it experienced all moments simultaneously, past and future equally present and real. This made Dialga's existence a form of torture, unable to experience linear progression, unable to have experiences that were truly new or surprising. Everything had already happened and was still happening and would always be happening. The burden of maintaining time's flow meant Dialga could never rest or relax. Any lapse in attention could cause catastrophic temporal disruptions, meaning Dialga had to remain constantly vigilant across all of eternity. The pressure of such responsibility, the knowledge that any mistake could unravel reality itself, created a state of permanent anxiety. Palkia's relationship with space carried similar weight. The Pokemon had to maintain the boundaries between dimensions, ensuring parallel realities didn't collapse into each other. This meant being aware of infinite universes simultaneously, experiencing countless versions of events, unable to focus on any single reality without neglecting others. The strain of this awareness would break any normal consciousness. Palkia had to process information from multiple dimensions at once, making decisions that affected all realities, while maintaining enough coherence to function. The fact that Palkia remained sane suggested either incredible mental fortitude or that its consciousness operated on principles humans couldn't comprehend. Giratina's banishment for violence seemed particularly cruel, given that Arceus had created it specifically to govern antimatter and the distortion world. Giratina was punishing for acting according to its nature, exiled for being what Arceus designed it to be. The creator made something violent and then condemned it for violence. The relationship between these creation trio Pokemon was marked by conflict and resentment. Dialga and Palkia fought when their domains intersected, neither willing to yield to the other. Giratina resented both of them for getting to exist in the normal world, while it was trapped in the distortion world. The family Arceus created was fundamentally broken. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, represented knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively, but their creation came with inherent danger. Uxie's knowledge was so vast that anyone who looked into its eyes would have their memory completely erased, mind wiped clean by the overflow of information. This made Uxie incredibly lonely, unable to make eye contact with anyone without destroying their personality. The Pokemon of knowledge was forever isolated by the very thing that defined it, cursed to keep its eyes closed or stare only at the ground. Any relationship Uxie formed would be conducted in darkness or peripheral vision. Mesprit's connection to emotion was equally problematic. The Pokemon could sense all emotions within a vast radius, experiencing everyone's joy and pain simultaneously. Happy moments were amplified, but so was suffering, meaning Mesprit lived in a constant state of emotional overwhelm, feeling everything everyone felt all at once. The empathic burden Mesprit carried would be crushing for any being. It couldn't tune out the emotional noise, couldn't choose to only feel positive emotions or to shut down its sensitivity. Every moment of existence meant experiencing the collective emotional state of all beings nearby, a cacophony of feeling that allowed no peace. Azelf represented willpower, but its Pokédex entries warned that anyone who harmed Azelf would lose all motivation and desire, becoming essentially catatonic. This defense mechanism turned Azelf into a potential doomsday weapon. If someone killed Azelf, they would condemn themselves to a living death, conscious but without any drive to act or think or care. The three Lake Guardians couldn't safely interact with other beings without risking harm. Uxie would erase memories, Mesprit would overwhelm with emotions, and Azelf would drain willpower if threatened. They existed in forced isolation, separated from the world by their very nature. Team Galactic's plan to capture these three and use them to summon Dialga or Palkia demonstrated either profound ignorance or deliberate cruelty. Chaining the Lake Guardians, forcing them to use their powers against their will, caused them immense suffering. The machines used to extract their power were explicitly described as draining their life force. The scene where the player confronts Cyrus at Spear Pillar showed the Lake Guardians weakened and in pain, barely conscious after prolonged torture. They had been reduced to power sources, their consciousness irrelevant to Team Galactic's goals. The suffering inflicted on these innocent Pokemon went largely unaddressed by the game's narrative. Cyrus's motivation for attempting to create a new universe stemmed from his belief that spirit, emotion, and incomplete knowledge were sources of all suffering. He saw the current world as flawed beyond repair and wanted to make something perfect, even if that meant destroying everything that currently existed. The nihilism underlying this philosophy was staggering. Cyrus believed so strongly that existence was suffering that he was willing to commit universal genocide to fix it. Every person, every Pokemon, every living thing would cease to exist, replaced by whatever sterile perfection Cyrus envisioned. The implication that Cyrus himself would survive this apocalypse and rule the new universe as a god showed the ultimate selfishness of his plan. It wasn't about reducing suffering, it was about creating a world that conformed to his preferences, where messy things like emotion and free will didn't complicate his control. The player's intervention stopped Cyrus, but the question of what happened to him after his plan failed remained troublingly vague. Some versions suggested he was trapped in the distortion world with Giratina, doomed to spend eternity in the one place that perfectly embodied the chaos and incompleteness he had tried to destroy. If Cyrus was indeed trapped in the distortion world, his fate was arguably worse than death. He would exist forever in a dimension that violated every principle of order and logic he valued, unable to escape, unable to die, forced to experience the very thing he had dedicated his life to eliminating. The night continues its slow drift toward morning, and these tales of creation and destruction blend together in the gathering darkness. The Pokemon world holds more shadows than any child's game should contain, more existential horror than bright colors and cheerful music can fully disguise. But perhaps that complexity makes it more real, more worthy of the deep affection fans feel toward it. Nothing perfect can be truly loved, only things with flaws and darkness and depth can earn genuine attachment. As sleep finally claims you, let these stories settle into the back of your mind, becoming part of the rich tapestry of mythology that makes Pokemon more than just a game. The disturbing lore will still be there tomorrow, waiting to be examined in daylight, but for now, let it all blur together into the gentle static of approaching sleep. Rest well, and know that even in darkness, there are always stories worth telling. Across 29 years of games, animated episodes, trading cards, and whispered playground rumors, the Pokemon universe has quietly accumulated a constellation of mysteries that shimmer just beneath its surface. Some theories emerge from forgotten dialogue, hidden in dusty mansion journals, while others bloom from the strange visual choices designers made in the earliest pixel art, back when no one imagined these creatures would endure for generations. Tonight, we'll drift through these theories, moving softly from the plausible to the peculiar, from the heartwarming to the haunting, listening for the hidden narratives that exist between the lines of official canon. Before we drift any deeper, make sure you're subscribed so you can continue these quiet journeys with us, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The best place to begin this gentle journey is with a theory so persistent it has followed the series since its very first episode, where a young trainer and a reluctant electric mouse first sparked a friendship that would shape everything to follow. The coma theory suggests that Ash Ketchum never truly woke from the Spearow attack in the opening episode, and that everything viewers have witnessed across more than 1,000 episodes exists only within his unconscious mind. When Pikachu unleashed that tremendous thundershock to protect Ash from the descending flock, the explosion knocked the young trainer to the ground, where he lay motionless in the rain. According to this interpretation, the vision of Ho-Oh flying overhead as the storm cleared wasn't a blessing or a prophecy, but rather the first flicker of a dream state that would stretch on indefinitely. This would explain the most persistent oddity about Ash's journey, the fact that he remains perpetually 10 years old despite traveling through multiple regions, witnessing the changing of seasons, and forming relationships with dozens of companions who come and go while he stays frozen in childhood. The theory proposes that time doesn't pass for Ash because he exists in a liminal space between consciousness and death, where the rules of aging and consequence bend to accommodate his subconscious desires. The coma theory draws additional support from the increasingly surreal nature of Ash's adventures as the series progresses, with each new region introducing more fantastical legendary Pokemon, more improbable coincidences, and more dramatic escalations that somehow reset to a comfortable baseline by the start of the next journey. His companions cycle through, with dreamlike fluidity, each one bringing new skills and perspectives before fading away when the narrative no longer needs them, much like how dream characters can feel intensely real in the moment but dissipate upon waking. The theory suggests that Ash's mind is constructing elaborate scenarios to keep itself occupied, drawing on fragments of real experiences and cultural knowledge to build an ever expanding fantasy world. Each gym battle, each league tournament, each encounters with Team Rocket follows patterns that feel simultaneously fresh and familiar, the way dreams often remix elements from waking life into new configurations. Some versions of this theory point to the presence of legendary Pokemon as evidence of wish fulfillment, arguing that no ordinary trainer would encounter Mewtwo, Lugia, Groudon, Kyogre, and countless other mythical beings with such regularity unless reality itself had become untethered from probability. The theory acknowledges that the Pokemon world has always blended the mundane with the magical, but suggests that Ash's experiences push beyond even the generous boundaries of that universe's internal logic. His survival of countless life threatening situations, from avalanches to energy beams to falling from great heights, becomes more comprehensible when viewed through the lens of dream immunity, where the dreamer can face danger without true consequence because some protective instinct prevents the subconscious from allowing genuine harm to manifest within the dream. The emotional core of the coma theory rests on the idea that Ash's journey represents his mind's attempt to process the trauma of that first day, when his confidence and innocence were shattered by a violent encounter with wild Pokemon he couldn't control. In this reading, every friend he makes, every Pokemon he bonds with, every victory he achieves becomes an act of psychological healing, his subconscious gradually rebuilding his sense of self worth and capability through imagined accomplishments. The theory doesn't necessarily frame this as tragic, but rather as a touching testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the way consciousness can construct elaborate scaffolding to support itself through impossible circumstances. Of course, the theory remains speculation, a fan creation born from the desire to explain narrative inconsistencies through a single unifying framework, but it demonstrates how deeply audiences have engaged with these stories, searching for hidden meanings in the spaces where logic seems to bend. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we encounter another theory that has persisted since the original games, one that focuses on a small pink Pokemon found wandering the Cerulean Cave and the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. Ditto, the transformed Pokemon, shares several curious characteristics with Mew and Mewtwo that have led many to speculate about its true origins. Both Ditto and Mew are pink in their natural state, and both share the unique ability to learn every technical machine and hidden machine move, a trait possessed by no other Pokemon except these two. When shiny forms were introduced in later generations, both Ditto and Mew display the same light blue coloration, another parallel that seems unlikely to be coincidental. The theory proposes that Ditto represents a failed attempt to clone Mew, one of many experiments conducted by scientists on Cinnabar Island before they finally achieved success with Mewtwo. The environmental storytelling in the original games lends credence to this interpretation, as Ditto can be found in the same locations where evidence of genetic experimentation appears. The Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island contains journals detailing the process of creating Mewtwo from Mew's DNA, with the entries describing various setbacks and complications before the final breakthrough. The entries mention that the cloning process proved far more difficult than anticipated, with many attempts at ending in failure or producing unexpected results. Ditto's unusual cellular structure, which allows it to temporarily reorganize itself into a perfect copy of any Pokemon it observes, could represent an intermediate step in the cloning process, where scientists successfully replicated Mew's adaptability but couldn't yet maintain a stable form. The abundance of Ditto in these specific locations suggests they may be the discarded results of numerous failed experiments, creatures that survived the process but didn't meet the scientists' criteria for success. The theory gains additional texture when considering Ditto's limitations compared to its proposed genetic source. While Mew can naturally transform into any Pokemon and maintain that form indefinitely, Ditto's transformations last only as long as it maintains concentration, reverting to its amorphous blob state when knocked unconscious or when the battle ends. This could this could indicate that the scientists successfully copied Mew's transformation ability, but couldn't replicate whatever genetic mechanism allows Mew to stabilize those transformations. Additionally, when Ditto transforms, it sometimes retains its own simple facial features rather than perfectly mimicking the target's expression, another sign that the copying process remains imperfect, perhaps because the cloning technique hadn't yet advanced to the point where it could fully replicate Mew's sophisticated cellular memory. From a narrative perspective, the Ditto Mew connection adds a layer of tragedy to both Pokemon's stories. If Ditto represents failed clones, then each one is a sentient being that exists only because it didn't quite meet someone's definition of success, creatures whose entire existence serves as evidence of scientific ambition's collateral damage. Yet Ditto don't seem to suffer from this origin, happily transforming into whatever shape brings them joy or serves their needs, finding contentment in an identity defined by fluidity rather than fixedness. The theory doesn't appear in official canon, but it resonates with fans because it finds meaning in design coincidences, transforming what might be aesthetic similarities into a hidden story about creation, failure, and adaptation. Whether intentional or not, the connection between these pink shapeshifters invites contemplation about what makes a being successful and whether failed experiments can still lead full lives. Slowly, the story widens to encompass another mystery from the earliest generation, one involving a powerful fire type Pokemon whose status has puzzled players since they first encountered it. Arcanine bears the species classification of legendary Pokemon in its Pokédex entry, a designation that seems to contradict everything else the games establish about legendary status. Legendary Pokemon typically exist as singular entities or extremely limited populations, often tied to creation myths, natural phenomena, or ancient history. Arcanine, meanwhile, can be bred from Growlithe, appears in the wild in certain locations, and serves as the signature Pokemon of Officer Jenny's law enforcement family, suggesting a stable breeding population. This contradiction has led to speculation that Arcanine was originally planned as a legendary Pokemon alongside Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, but was reclassified during development for reasons that were never fully explained. The most frequently cited evidence for this theory comes from the second episode of the original anime, where a mural in the Viridian City Pokemon Center depicts four Pokemon in positions suggesting equal legendary status. The image clearly shows Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, but the fourth Pokemon in the composition appears to be Arcanine rather than any of the other known legendary Pokemon from the first generation. This visual placement implies that at some point in the series' development, Arcanine held a position equivalent to the legendary birds, perhaps as a fourth member of a quartet representing different elemental forces. The decision to include this specific image in such an early episode, before the anime had fully established its relationship to game canon, suggests that the artists were working from design documents that reflected an earlier version of the Pokemon hierarchy. From a design perspective, Arcanine's appearance and stat distribution align more closely with legendary Pokemon than with typical evolved forms. Its base stat total of 555 places, it's significantly above most non-legendary Pokémon from the first generation, though still below the 600 threshold typically reserved for legendary trios. Its majestic appearance, with flowing mane and noble bearing, evokes mythical creatures from various cultural traditions, giving it a presence that feels more archetypal than the relatively straightforward designs of most regular Pokémon. The Pokédex entries emphasize its incredible speed and the way ancient cultures revered it, describing how its magnificent bark conveys a sense of majesty, and noting that anyone who hears it can't help but grovel before it. This language mirrors the reverent tone used for legendary Pokémon, treating Arcanine as a creature of almost mythological significance, rather than simply a powerful evolved form. The theory proposes several possible explanations for why Arcanine might have been demoted from legendary status during development. One suggestion holds that the developers wanted the legendary trio to consist exclusively of birds, creating a cohesive thematic grouping that would be diluted by including a canine Pokemon. Another possibility points to game balance concerns, as having a breedable legendary Pokemon would have complicated the careful restrictions Game Freak placed on legendary encounters and acquisition. A third interpretation suggests that the species classification legendary Pokemon in Arcanine's Pokedex entry doesn't refer to game mechanics, but rather to its status within the Pokemon world's mythology, much like how certain rare animals in our world might be called legendary in folklore without being literally unique. This reading allows Arcanine to be both a legendary creature in cultural terms and a regular Pokemon in game mechanical terms, resolving the apparent contradiction through definitional nuance. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where the boundaries between design intention and fan interpretation blur into something more interesting than either would be alone. Whether Arcanine truly began as a legendary Pokemon or simply carries design elements that suggest legendary status, the theory highlights how closely fans attend to the visual and textual details of the games, constructing narratives to explain inconsistencies and gaps in official explanations. The theory has persisted for nearly 3 decades, not because it necessarily reflects development reality, but because it offers a more satisfying explanation than the Pokedex entry writer chose odd wording, or the anime artists included Arcanine for compositional balance. It transforms a potential oversight into a hidden story about creative decisions made under time pressure when every choice rippled through multiple media formats in ways the original designers couldn't fully anticipate. Before we continue this gentle journey, let's consider a theory that examines the relationship between two bug type evolutionary lines and questions whether a mistake was made during the original game's development. Caterpie evolves into Metapod, and then Butterfree, while Weedle evolves into Kakuna and then Beedrill, two parallel evolution chains that mirror each other structurally. However, when examining the visual designs of these Pokemon, certain inconsistencies emerge that have led fans to speculate about a possible swap. Butterfree, with its compound eyes, small limbs, and purple coloration, shares more visual characteristics with Venonat than with its supposed pre-evolution Metapod. Meanwhile, Venomoth's design, with its longer antennae and specific eye structure, seems to echo elements present in Caterpie and Metapod, suggesting a visual continuity that the current evolution chain lacks. The theory proposes that during the hectic development period of the original Pokemon Red and Green, the final evolutions of these two lines were accidentally swapped, and by the time anyone noticed the error, it was too late to correct it without delaying the game's release. This hypothesis attempts to explain why Butterfree looks so different from its cocoon stage, lacking the visual through line that typically characterizes Pokemon evolution chains. In most evolution families, you can trace design elements from the first stage through to the final stage, seeing how fins become wings, how color patterns persist or gradually shift, how the basic body structure grows more complex while maintaining recognizable features. The Caterpie line breaks this pattern, with Butterfree appearing to introduce entirely new design elements that have no precedent in Caterpie or Metapod, while discarding elements like the simple eyes and segmented body that defined the earlier forms. If one imagines swapping the final evolutions, Caterpie would evolve into Metapod, and then Venomoth, while Weedle would evolve into Kakuna, and then Butterfree. This rearrangement creates two evolution chains that feel more visually coherent, with design elements flowing more naturally from stage to stage. Venomoth's large compound eyes echo the simple eyes of Caterpie, while its antennae extend the facial features established in the earlier stages. The overall body structure of Venomoth, with its furry thorax and multiple legs, connects more obviously to Caterpie's caterpillar form than Butterfree's more streamlined butterfly body. Similarly, Butterfree's small hands and feet relate more clearly to Weedle's pointed appendages, while its coloration parallels the yellow and black warning colors present in the Weedle line. The compound eyes that are Butterfree's most distinctive feature match the large red eyes that Venonat displays, creating another visual link that the current arrangement lacks. Skeptics of this theory point out that evolution in the Pokemon world doesn't always follow real world biological logic, and that dramatic transformations between stages are not unprecedented. They note that many evolution chains introduce new elements that seem to come from nowhere, and that the visual discontinuity between Metapod and Butterfree might be intentional, representing the dramatic metamorphosis that occurs during a butterfly's pupal stage. Additionally, they argue that if such a significant error had occurred, someone at Game Freak would have mentioned it in the nearly 30 years since the game's release, particularly given how openly developers have discussed other cut content and development challenges. The lack of any official acknowledgement of a swap, despite numerous interviews and retrospectives about the original game's creation, suggests that the current arrangement reflects the designer's intentions rather than an unnoticed mistake. Yet the theory persists because it offers a more elegant solution than accepting that Game Freak simply created two evolution chains with unusual visual discontinuities. It provides a narrative explanation for what might otherwise be dismissed as aesthetic inconsistency, transforming a potential design flaw into a hidden development story about the chaos of creating a game with 150 distinct creatures under severe time and resource constraints. The theory also resonates with anyone who has worked on creative projects under pressure, where small errors can slip through quality control and become permanently embedded in the final product. Whether true or not, the Butterfree Venomoth swap theory demonstrates how fans engage with Pokemon design at a deep level, analyzing visual relationships and evolutionary logic to construct theories that make the world feel more internally consistent. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we encounter a theory that attempts to explain one of the most unsettling mysteries in the Pokemon world: the identity and origins of Cubone's skull helmet. Cubone's Pokédex entries consistently state that it wears the skull of its deceased mother, a piece of information that raises immediate questions about Pokemon biology, death, and reproduction. If every Cubone wears its mother's skull, that implies that every Cubone's mother dies during or shortly after giving birth, an extraordinarily dark premise for a series generally aimed at younger audiences. The theory that has emerged to address this disturbing implication suggests that Cubonin represents the orphaned child of a Kangaskhan, and that the skull it wears originally belonged to its Kangaskhan mother. This hypothesis draws support from several visual and narrative connections between these two Pokemon. When comparing the subtle Cubone wears to the shape of Kangaskhan's head, The proportions and structure align more closely than with Kubone's own head shape beneath the bone. The eye sockets, snout length, and overall skull architecture match what a Kangaskhan skull would plausibly look like, suggesting that the helmet didn't come from another Cubone, but from a larger, related species. Additionally, the baby Kangaskhan visible in its mother's pouch bears a striking resemblance to Cubone's basic body structure, with similar proportions, limb arrangement, and coloration. The theory proposes that when a Kangaskhan mother dies, her orphaned child removes itself from her pouch and takes her skull as both protection and memento, eventually becoming the Pokemon we recognize as Cubone. The mechanics of this transformation remain deliberately vague in the theory, with some versions suggesting that the grief and trauma of losing its mother triggers a form of stress induced evolution, permanently altering the baby Kangaskhan's physiology and typing. Others propose that Cubone isn't technically an evolution of Kangaskhan, but rather a traumatic divergent form that only occurs under specific tragic circumstances, explaining why Kangaskhan babies typically grow into Kangaskhan themselves rather than Cubone. This would make Cubone an incredibly rare Pokemon biologically, though common enough in game populations to suggest that Kangaskhan mortality occurs with unfortunate frequency in the wild. The change from normal type to ground type could represent the young Pokemon's adaptation to a life alone on the Earth, rather than carried safely in its mother's pouch, forced to burrow and hide to survive without parental protection. When Cubone eventually evolves into Marowak, it finally overcomes its grief enough to stand on its own, though it never removes the skull that has become both armor and identity. Marowak's increased size and strength suggest a Pokemon that has learned to channel its loss into resilience, using the Bone Club as both weapon and reminder of what it survived. The theory adds poignant depth to an already melancholy Pokemon, recontextualizing Cubone's loneliness as not just the loss of a mother, but the loss of an entire species' identity, orphaned not only from family, but from the evolutionary path it should have followed. This interpretation transforms Cubone from a creature whose species has an unusually high maternal mortality rate into a Pokemon whose very existence represents a tragic deviation from normal development, a child forever marked by the circumstances of its mother's death. Critics of the Cubone Kangaskhan connection point out several mechanical problems with the theory. Cubone and Marowak can be bred in the games, and they produce Cubone eggs rather than Kangaskhan eggs, suggesting they are a distinct species rather than trauma-altered Kangaskhan. Additionally, breeding a Kangaskhan always produces another Kangaskhan egg, never a Cubone, which contradicts the theory's proposal that Cubone originates from Kangaskhan mothers who die. The theory would require that Cubone has somehow become a self-sustaining species, despite its origins as orphaned Kangaskhan babies, developing the ability to reproduce more Cubone through some unexplained mechanism. These mechanical inconsistencies lead skeptics to argue that the visual similarities between Cubone and baby Kangaskhan are coincidental, or at most represent recycled design elements that Game Freak reused for efficiency during the rushed development of the original games. Yet the emotional resonance of the theory ensures its persistence in fan discussions, because it provides a more satisfying explanation for Cubone's unsettling Pokédex entries than accepting that an entire species has evolved to require maternal death as part of its life cycle. The theory allows players to understand Cubone's sadness as individual tragedy rather than systematic horror, making it possible to feel compassion for each Cubone without confronting the biological nightmare implicit in the official description. Whether true or not, the Kangaskhan connection highlights how fans actively work to make the Pokemon world's darker elements more comprehensible, smoothing over disturbing implications by constructing alternative narratives that preserve the series' generally optimistic tone while acknowledging the occasional darkness that seeps into the Pokédex entries. Before your eyes grow heavy, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos and share where you're watching from tonight. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where theories attempt to explain not just plot holes or design oddities, but the emotional texture of the Pokemon world itself. The theory about Cubone and Kangaskhan represents fans' desire to impose logic and compassion onto elements that might otherwise feel cruel or nonsensical, finding ways to honor the melancholy beauty of Cubone's story while making it sustainable within the broader world's biology and ethics. This impulse to explain, to make sense, to construct coherence from fragments drives many of the theories we'll explore tonight, each one representing an attempt to see the Pokemon world more clearly, to understand its rules and exceptions, its joys and sorrows, in ways that official sources never quite articulate. Another theory that has circulated since the early years of the franchise examines the mysterious absence of adult characters in the Pokemon world, particularly fathers and other adult men. Throughout the games and anime, children as young as 10 embark on journeys alone. Towns are populated primarily by mothers and grandparents, and the vast majority of trainers encountered en routes appear to be teenagers or young adults. This demographic oddity becomes even more pronounced when considering specific characters like Ash and Gary, both of whom have mothers who are present and supportive, but fathers who are absent and barely mentioned. The theory proposes that these missing adults, particularly adult men, died in a great war that occurred shortly before the events of the games, and that the current generation of children is growing up in a society still recovering from massive casualties. The primary textual evidence for this war theory comes from Lieutenant Surge, the Vermilion City gym leader, who mentions in passing that electric Pokemon saved me during the war. This single line of dialogue, easily missed in the context of a pre battle conversation, opens up questions about what war, when it occurred, who fought in it, and what the consequences were for the society players inhabit. The theory suggests that this wasn't a minor border skirmish, but a massive conflict that involved most of the major regions, explaining why so many towns seem to have an unusual gender and age demographic. The presence of predominantly female adults in caregiving and civilian roles implies that men of a certain age went to war and many didn't return, leaving behind widows and children to rebuild communities with drastically reduced populations. This interpretation adds a layer of unspoken tragedy to the world players explore. Professor Oak's relationship with Ash and Gary takes on new significance if interpreted through the lens of absent fathers, suggesting that Oak may be attempting to fill a paternal void for multiple children in Pallet Town. The emphasis on Pokemon as partners and protectors rather than weapons gains poignancy when viewed as a cultural shift following a devastating war, a collective decision to ensure that the next generation bonds with Pokemon in ways that emphasize friendship rather than combat. The relative peace and safety of the regions players explore represents hard-won stability, maintained by a generation determined to spare their children the violence they themselves experienced. Gyms and the Pokemon League take on the character of institutions designed to channel youthful energy and the human impulse toward competition into structured, non-lethal frameworks. The theory finds its additional support in small environmental details scattered throughout the games. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower serves as a massive cemetery where countless Pokemon are buried, suggesting regular contact with death on a scale that might reflect wartime casualties. The tower contains the ghost of a Marowak that was killed protecting its child, an event that occurred in living memory, pointing to recent violence in what's otherwise presented as a peaceful region. The absence of explanations for these oddities invites speculation, and the war theory provides a unifying framework that accounts for multiple strange elements simultaneously. It explains why society allows children to travel alone, why adults seem so eager to help young trainers, why the villainous teams players encounter are treated as serious threats despite seeming relatively small and disorganized. All of these patterns make more sense in a post war society rebuilding its institutions and determining what kind of world it wants to create. Skeptics note that the absence of fathers could be explained more simply as narrative convenience, allowing young protagonists to embark on adventures without parental supervision or lengthy explanations about why responsible adults would permit 10-year-olds to wander across dangerous wilderness areas. They point out that many games and children's stories minimize adult presence to maximize youth agency, and that reading complex historical trauma into what might be straightforward narrative choices risks overinterpreting design decisions made primarily for gameplay reasons. Additionally, later generations include more complete family structures, and while fathers remain less prominent than mothers, they do appear with increasing frequency, suggesting that any demographic oddity in the original games reflected early installment weirdness rather than deliberate world building about recent warfare. Yet the war theory persists because it recontextualizes the Pokemon world's utopian surface as a fragile achievement rather than a natural state, suggesting that the peace and prosperity players experience was built consciously by people who remembered alternatives. It adds weight to the conflicts that do occur in the games, making Team Rocket, Team Magma, Team Aqua, and subsequent antagonists feel more threatening because they represent the potential return of organized violence to a society that has worked hard to move beyond it. The theory transforms the Pokemon journey from a simple coming of age adventure into something more nuanced, a ritual that takes place in a world still carrying invisible scars, where young people learn to bond with powerful creatures in the shadow of a history no one wants to repeat. Whether intended by the developers or constructed entirely by fans, this interpretation finds depth in silence, meaning in absence, and suggests that even in worlds designed for children, traces of adult concerns can't be entirely erased. Slowly, the story widens to encompass another persistent theory about identity and deception, one that questions the true relationship between several recurring characters. The theory proposes that Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket and the most powerful crime boss in the Kanto region, is actually Ash Ketchum's biological father. This hypothesis attempts to explain several oddities about Ash's family situation while adding dramatic irony to his ongoing battles against Team Rocket. The theory notes that Ash's father is mentioned only once in the entire anime series, in the second episode, when Delia Ketchum vaguely states that Ash's father is still on his journey, implying he left home years ago to pursue his own goals as a trainer. This absence, never explained or explored in detail, creates a narrative void that the Giovanni theory attempts to fill. According to this interpretation, Giovanni and Professor Oak were once friends and rivals, both beginning their Pokemon journeys around the same time. Oak eventually settled down to pursue research and education, while Giovanni continued down a path that led to criminal enterprises and the formation of Team Rocket. The theory suggests that Giovanni had a relationship with Delia Ketchum before his full descent into villainy, and that he either doesn't know about Ash's existence or chooses not to acknowledge it to protect his son from his criminal associations. Oak's close relationship with Ash and his mother makes more sense in this context, as Oak would feel obligated to watch over his old friend's family, providing guidance and support that Giovanni cannot offer. The theory it transforms Ash's rivalry with Gary into something more complex, making them not just childhood competitors, but children of two men who followed vastly different life paths from similar starting points. The evidence for this theory remains circumstantial, relying primarily on the suspicious absence of any information about Ash's father, combined with Giovanni's occasional moments of restraint regarding Ash. Throughout the series, despite numerous opportunities, Team Rocket never seriously harms Ash, even when doing so would serve their strategic interests. Giovanni himself remains distant from the day to day operations involving Ash, delegating those missions to Jesse, James, and Meowth, who become more comedic nuisances than genuine threats. The theory proposes that Giovanni has given quiet instructions to keep Ash safe, allowing his subordinates to pursue the boy's Pikachu, but ensuring they never succeed in ways that would cause real harm. This would explain why Team Rocket's operations against Ash feel performative, elaborate schemes that collapse at the slightest resistance, as if designed to fail while maintaining plausible deniability. The timeline of when Giovanni began his criminal activities relative to Ash's birth creates additional complications that the theory addresses in various ways. If Giovanni left Pallet Town to become a crime lord after Ash was born, Delia's statement that he's still on his journey takes on a bittersweet quality, a euphemism that avoids explaining to young Ash that his father chose a path incompatible with family life. Alternatively, if Giovanni left before knowing about Delia's pregnancy, his absence becomes tragic rather than abandonment, a series of choices made without full knowledge of their consequences. Some versions of the theory suggest that Oak knows the truth about Ash's parentage and has made a conscious decision not to reveal it, judging that the knowledge would harm Ash more than the mystery of not knowing. This would add another layer to Oak's mentorship, making him not just a kindly professor, but someone carrying a secret that grows heavier with each passing year of silence. Critics argue that the theory relies too heavily on reading significance into narrative omissions, and that Ash's father remains absent simply because the story doesn't require his presence. They note that many animated series aimed at children minimize or eliminate fathers to simplify household dynamics and maintain focus on the protagonist's peer relationships and personal growth. The theory's dependence on Giovanni, showing occasional restraint toward Ash, ignores the fact that Giovanni generally appears disinterested in grunt level operations, rarely involving himself directly in schemes that don't threaten his larger strategic goals. His indifference to Ash could reflect a crime boss's natural prioritization of significant threats over a single, talented, but ultimately minor trainer, rather than secret paternal protection. Additionally, the Pokemon Company has confirmed that Ash's father was conceived as a trainer who left on a journey before Ash was born and simply never returned, a deliberately vague backstory meant to make Ash's determination to become a Pokemon master feel like both destiny and conscious choice. Yet the theory endures in fan discussions because it provides emotional depth to a relationship that officially doesn't exist, creating dramatic potential from absence. The idea that Ash unknowingly opposes his own father adds tragic dimension to Team Rocket's repeated defeats, suggesting that Giovanni watches from a distance as his son develops into exactly the kind of trainer he once aspired to be, before ambition and moral compromise led him down a different path. The theory also resonates with anyone who has grown up with an absent parent, finding in Ash's unspoken questions about his father an echo of their own experiences. Whether true or not, the Giovanni theory demonstrates how fans actively construct meaning from narrative gaps, using the spaces where official stories fall silent as places to plant more complex emotional narratives. Before we drift any further, let's contemplate a theory that examines the nature of Pokemon themselves, questioning whether these creatures are truly animals or something more ambiguous and unsettling. The theory proposes that Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny are not actually members of large families with eerily similar members, as the official explanation claims, but are instead clones mass produced to fill essential social roles across multiple regions. This hypothesis attempts to explain why these characters appear virtually identical across vast geographic distances, showing not just family resemblance, but seemingly perfect physical duplication down to height, weight, vocal characteristics, and even personality traits. The theory suggests that the Pokemon world has access to cloning technology far more advanced than the Mewtwo project revealed, and that this technology has been deployed to solve labor shortages in critical infrastructure positions. The official explanation that Nurse Joys are all cousins from an extended family dedicated to Pokemon healthcare raises more questions than it answers when examined closely. For a family to produce members this physically identical across multiple generations would require either extreme inbreeding or some other genetic mechanism that defies conventional biology. The anime occasionally acknowledges slight differences between different Nurse Joys, small variations in personality or interests that distinguish one from another, but these feel like cosmetic touches applied to identical templates rather than the natural variation one would expect from cousins who share a family tradition but not identical genetics. The same pattern appears with Officer Jenny, another extended family whose members all happen to look exactly alike, despite being spread across multiple continents. If we accept the cloning hypothesis, it reframes our understanding of the Pokemon world's technological and ethical landscape. The same scientists who created Mewtwo would have refined their cloning techniques to the point where they could produce fully functional, emotionally stable human clones capable of learning complex skills and integrating seamlessly into society. The decision to deploy this technology for Nurse Joy's and Officer Jenny's suggests a utilitarian calculation, a society deciding that the benefits of having experienced medical and law enforcement personnel available in even the most remote locations outweighs ethical concerns about human cloning and personal autonomy. Each Nurse Joy would be created with the knowledge and skills necessary to operate a Pokemon Center, perhaps through accelerated learning or pre implanted memories, allowing regions to maintain consistent healthcare standards, even in frontier towns that might struggle to attract trained personnel. The psychological implications of this interpretation are profound and troubling. If Nurse Joy's and Officer Jenny's are clones, do they know about their origins, or do they believe themselves to be members of large biological families? Do they experience existential questions about identity and individuality, or have they been engineered to find fulfillment in their designated roles? The anime shows these characters as generally content and efficient in their work. But under the cloning hypothesis, this contentment becomes potentially sinister, either evidence of psychological conditioning or the result of genetic modifications designed to make them naturally suited for their positions. The theory transforms helpful NPCs into something more unsettling, suggesting that the Pokemon world's apparent utopia rests partly on normalized human cloning and the instrumentalization of created beings. A variation on this theory suggests that Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny might not be human clones at all, but rather highly advanced Pokemon designed to mimic human appearance and behavior. This would explain their identical nature through ditto-like transformation abilities, or through specialized species whose natural form happens to resemble specific human phenotypes. This interpretation is even more disturbing in its implications, suggesting that the boundaries between human and Pokemon are more porous than commonly acknowledged, and that society has access to Pokemon capable of perfectly imitating human form for extended periods. Under this reading, the extended family explanation becomes a cover story to prevent panic, a socially acceptable lie that allows people to interact with these beings without confronting the disquieting reality of what they truly are. Skeptics dismiss the clone theory as unnecessary complexity, arguing that the identical appearance of Nurse Joy's and Officer Jenny's simply reflects animation convenience and aesthetic choice, creating unique character models for every Pokemon Center and police station across multiple regions would have been prohibitively expensive and time consuming for the anime's production schedule, so designers made the pragmatic choice to reuse character models while hand waving the explanation through the large family justification. They point out that many elements of the anime prioritize narrative efficiency over strict realism, and that reading sinister implications into what's essentially a production shortcut misses the point of these characters, who exist primarily as helpful NPCs rather than developed individuals. The games that avoid this issue entirely by using generic nurse and officer sprites that don't pretend to be specific recurring characters. Yet the clone theory persists because it takes the anime's internal logic seriously, accepting the world's premise that these are real, recurring individuals named Joy and Jenny rather than generic representatives of their professions. By treating the identical appearance as a fact requiring explanation rather than a production convenience requiring forgiveness, the theory opens up uncomfortable questions about the Pokemon world's ethics and the technologies it has normalized. Whether the explanation involves cloning, genetic manipulation, or something else entirely, the identical Joys and Jennies represent a strangeness at the heart of the Pokemon world that official sources acknowledge, but never adequately explain, leaving space for theories that find darkness beneath the surface of helpful, smiling faces. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we encounter a theory that has caused considerable debate about evolution mechanics and the consistency of Pokemon biology across generations. The theory proposes that Marill was originally designed as a pre evolution of Clefairy, and that certain design choices still reflect this abandoned connection. Both Pokemon share round body types, stubby limbs, similar ear shapes, and pink coloration, though Marill's blue hue represents a color variation that was introduced when the connection was severed. When Marill's evolution into Azumarill occurs, it becomes even more round and pink, bringing it closer in appearance to Clefairy than to its own water-type aesthetic, suggesting that the original design progression was meant to flow from Marill to Clefairy rather than from Marill to Azumarill. The theory gains additional traction when considering the types involved. Clefairy was originally a normal type Pokemon before being reclassified as Fairy type in Generation 6, while Marill carries dual water and Fairy typing from the moment Fairy type was introduced. This typing overlap suggests a potential connection between the two evolutionary lines that Game Freak later emphasized through the type system. If Marill had originally been conceived as Clefairy's pre-evolution, it would have made sense as a normal type that gained fairy typing upon evolving into Clefairy, then gained pure fairy typing upon reaching Clefable. When plans changed and Marill became its own independent line, the designers kept the round body plan and some of the pink coloration while shifting it toward water type aesthetic, creating a Pokemon that straddles two different visual families. The introduction of baby Pokemon in Generation 2, including Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, and others, suggests that Game Freak was actively reconsidering evolution chains and adding new stages to existing families during the development period when Marill was created. Cleffa, Clefairy's official baby form, was introduced in the same generation as Marill, raising questions about why two separate pink, round, fairy like creatures with similar body plans were created simultaneously. One possible explanation is that Moril originally served as Clefairy's pre-evolution, but during development, designers decided they wanted Cleffa to be even smaller and cuter, more explicitly a baby form rather than a young adult form. Moril, already designed and possibly already programmed into the game, was instead given its own evolution chain with Azumarill, and the team created Cleffa to fill the baby Pokemon slot for the Clefairy line. Critics of this theory note that beyond superficial visual similarities, Moril and Clefairy don't share much in common. Their stat distributions differ significantly. Their learn sets have almost no overlap, and their thematic roles in the game diverge completely, with Clefairy associated with the moon and mystical elements, while Moril connects to rivers, lakes, and water-based environments. The theory requires assuming a much more dramatic redesign occurred during development than the available evidence supports, essentially proposing that Moril was completely reconcepted from scratch while retaining only its basic body shape from the original Clefairy connection. The existence of Cleffa provides a simpler explanation for why Clefairy needed a pre-evolution, and Moril's design could simply reflect early Generation 2's aesthetic preferences for round, cute Pokemon rather than any specific connection to Clefairy's family. Yet the theory resonates with fans who enjoy analyzing design decisions and imagining the alternative versions of Pokemon that might have existed. It highlights how development is rarely linear, how creatures may be conceived for one purpose and ultimately serve another, how connections between designs can persist even after their logical justification has been removed. Whether Moril truly began as a Clefairy pre-evolution or simply shares design DNA with the earlier Pokemon due to similar aesthetic goals, the theory demonstrates how attentively fans examine the visual language of Pokemon design, noticing patterns and similarities that spark questions about creative process and developmental decisions. The theory keeps alive the possibility that the Pokemon we know could have been very different, that every final design represents just one path through an infinite forest of alternatives. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where design curiosities become windows into creative process, where similarities invite speculation about roads not taken. The Moril Clefairy connection, whether real or imagined, reminds us that Pokemon designs don't emerge fully formed, but go through iterations, adjustments, and sometimes radical reconceptions during development. Each creature we encounter in the games carries ghosts of earlier versions, abandoned ideas that still echo in final forms, design choices that might have served different purposes before settling into their current arrangements. Theories like this honor the complexity of creative work, acknowledging that what seems like a finished product actually contains layers of revision and reconsideration visible only to those who look closely enough. Another theory that has persisted since the original game's release examines the mysterious presence of ghost-type Pokemon and what their existence implies about death in the Pokemon universe. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower serves as a massive graveyard where trainers bury their deceased partners, a location that takes on additional significance when players encounter the ghost of a Marowak whose spirit cannot rest because it died protecting its child from Team Rocket. This scene confirms that Pokemon can die, that death is permanent and leaves behind spirits in some cases, and that these spirits can linger in locations associated with their deaths. The theory proposes that all ghost-type Pokemon are, in fact, deceased Pokemon or deceased humans whose spirits have taken on new forms, making the ghost type less a biological category and more a spiritual classification. The Marowak's ghost provides the clearest evidence for this interpretation, as it appears as a translucent, aggressive spirit that attacks players until they use the Sylph Scope to reveal its true identity. A Upon recognition, the ghost's rage subsides and it departs to the afterlife, suggesting that its lingering presence stemmed from unresolved trauma rather than a natural state of being. This event establishes that death creates spirits capable of interaction with the physical world, and that these spirits maintain some form of consciousness and purpose even after physical death. If one Pokemon can become a persistent ghost after death, the theory reasons, then perhaps all ghost type Pokemon represent similar transformations. Deceased beings who have remained in the physical world long enough to be categorized and cataloged as if they were living creatures. Examining specific ghost Pokemon through this lens creates intriguing and sometimes disturbing implications. Haunter and Gengar, which evolved from Ghastly, might represent the progressive stages of a spirit becoming more grounded in physical reality, growing more solid and capable of interacting with matter as it adapts to its non living state. Duskull, whose Pokédex entry describes it as seeking out crying children and making off with them, takes on horror movie connotations if interpreted as a deceased being acting out disturbing compulsions. Yamask, introduced in Generation 5, carries a mask that is stated explicitly to be a mask that was the face it had when it was human, confirming that at least one ghost type Pokemon represents a transformed human soul. If Yamask proves that humans can become Pokemon after death, the theory extends this possibility to all ghost types, suggesting that the boundary between human, Pokemon, and spirit is far more fluid than commonly acknowledged. The breeding mechanics complicate this interpretation significantly. Ghost type Pokemon can breed and produce eggs just like any other Pokemon, suggesting they have biological functions and can reproduce through conventional means. If ghost Pokemon are deceased spirits, how do they create offspring? Some versions of the theory propose that ghost Pokemon exist in a liminal space between life and death, neither truly living nor fully dead, but rather occupying a quantum state that allows them both spiritual properties and biological functions. Another interpretation suggests that ghost type eggs don't actually contain living embryos, but rather solidified ectoplasm or condensed spiritual energy that will eventually develop consciousness, creating new spirits rather than birthing living creatures. These explanations feel like stretches, attempts to preserve the theory in the face of mechanical evidence that suggests ghost Pokemon are simply another type category rather than ontologically distinct from other creatures. The most compelling argument against the all ghost Pokemon are dead theory comes from the fact that ghost type Pokemon faint rather than die when defeated in battle and can be healed at Pokemon centers just like other Pokemon. If they were truly spirits without physical bodies, conventional medicine and healing shouldn't affect them, unless we suppose that Pokemon Center technology has spiritual dimensions not explicitly acknowledged in the games. The theory also struggles to explain regional variants, like Alolan Marowak, which gains ghost typing not through death, but through evolution in a specific environment, suggesting that ghost type can be a biological adaptation rather than a spiritual state. These inconsistencies lead most players to conclude that ghost Pokemon are living creatures with ghost like properties rather than actual ghosts, and that the type name reflects aesthetic and thematic elements rather than literal death state. Yet the theory persists in fan imaginations because it adds existential weight to an otherwise straightforward gameplay category. The possibility that ghost Pokemon are deceased beings lingering in the physical world transforms them from spooky creatures into tragic figures, souls unable or unwilling to pass on, maintaining presence through force of will or unresolved trauma. This interpretation makes training ghost Pokemon feel more like providing comfort to lost spirits than commanding powerful creatures, adds poignancy to their loyalty and obedience, and suggests that the bond between trainer and ghost type carries different emotional overtones than other partnerships. Whether true or not, the theory honors the eerie beauty of ghost Pokemon designs and the way they've always existed at the edge of the Pokemon world's rules, creatures that don't quite fit cleanly into the biology and physics that govern other species. Slowly, the story widens to encompass the theory that has probably disturbed more young players than any other, the suggestion that the player character in the original Pokemon Red and Blue games is dead, and that the entire adventure takes place in a ghostly afterlife. This theory, known as the Ghost or White Hand theory, originated from a series of unsettling experiences players reported when encountering the ghost in Pokemon Tower before obtaining the Sylph Scope. The ghost appears as a formless white sprite, and when interacted with, the screen distorts and flashes while text reads, "The ghost is so scary that it's paralyzed." This glitch like presentation, combined with Lavender Town's famously disturbing music, created an atmosphere of genuine unease that stuck with players long after they left the tower. The theory proposes that the player character died during the adventure, possibly from one of the many dangerous situations encountered during the journey, and that everything after a certain point represents a liminal space between life and death. In this interpretation, Lavender Town serves as a kind of threshold location, a place where the veil between the living world and the afterlife becomes thin enough for the dead player to perceive their true state. The ghost in a Pokemon Tower doesn't attack because it recognizes a fellow spirit, and its scary nature comes from serving as a mirror, showing the player character a reflection of their own deceased state. The inability to interact with the ghost without the Sylph Scope represents the player's denial of their death, with the scope serving as a metaphorical tool that allows acceptance of reality. Supporting details for this theory point to various oddities in the game's progression. After Lavender Town, the game's tone arguably becomes more surreal, with legendary Pokemon appearing with increasing frequency, enemies' plans growing more grandiose and world threatening, and the player encountering beings of immense power that seem unlikely to cross paths with a 10-year-old trainer under normal circumstances. The theory suggests that these escalating supernatural encounters reflect a soul moving deeper into the afterlife, experiencing increasingly fantastical scenarios as they drift further from mortal reality. The final battle with the Elite Four takes place in an isolated mountain fortress, reached only by navigating a dark cave, creating a sense of ascending to a final judgment or crossing a final threshold. Victory over the champion and entering the Hall of Fame could represent the soul finally finding peace and moving fully into the afterlife. The Lavender Town music, a simple melody that has become infamous among Pokemon fans, plays a significant role in the theory's psychological impact. The tune uses high pitched tones and an unusual chord progression that creates an unsettling atmosphere, particularly when played through the Game Boy's primitive sound chip. Urban legends spread among early players about the Lavender Town syndrome, claiming that the music's frequency caused headaches, nausea, and even deaths among Japanese children, though these stories have been thoroughly debunked as creepypasta with no factual basis. Nevertheless, the music's genuinely eerie quality contributed to Lavender Town's reputation as a haunting location, making it fertile ground for theories about death and the afterlife. Skeptics rightfully point out that the theory imposes a dark interpretation onto what is fundamentally a children's game, finding sinister implications in design choices and plot progressions that have simpler explanations. The ghost in Pokemon Tower appears scary because ghost Pokemon are supposed to be spooky, The Sylph Scope allows you to see it because the plot requires a special item to progress, and the tone doesn't particularly shift after Lavender Town unless you're actively looking for evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. The legendary Pokemon appear late in the game because that's basic game design, saving the most powerful and interesting creatures for when players have developed the skills to appreciate and catch them. Reading the player character as dead requires ignoring all the straightforward plot elements, the people who continue to recognize and interact with the player, the fact that Pokemon Center healing still works, the way the world continues to function according to consistent rules rather than dream logic. Yet the theory endures as a particularly vivid example of how the right atmospheric choices can inspire dark interpretations even in innocent contexts. Lavender Town's music and visual design were clearly intended to evoke a sense of unease, appropriate to a town centered around a Pokemon graveyard, but they succeeded so well that players' imaginations filled in implications the designers never intended. The theory demonstrates how audiences actively construct meaning from their experiences, how the interplay between design choices and player interpretation can generate narratives that exist independently of authorial intent. Whether the theory reflects anything real about the game's development or not, it has become part of Pokemon's cultural legacy, a shared spooky story that connects players across generations, proof that even in the brightest, most wholesome gaming franchises, shadows find places to gather. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is, where you're watching from. Another theory examines the bizarre evolution of Remoraid into Octillery, two Pokemon whose designs share so little visual continuity that players have long wondered whether a mistake occurred during its development. Remoraid, a fish-shaped water-type Pokemon resembling a gray and red revolver, evolves at level 25 into Octillery, an octopus-shaped Pokemon with no obvious visual connection to its pre-evolution. The transformation abandons Remoraid's streamlined body, its gun-like proportions, and its color scheme, replacing all of these with a completely different creature that seems to belong to an entirely separate evolutionary family. This drastic discontinuity has led some fans to theorize that Remoraid was originally intended to evolve into a different Pokemon, possibly Mantine, while Octillery was meant to be paired with a different pre-evolution. The theory proposes that Remoraid's original evolution was into Mantine, a large manta ray Pokemon also introduced in Generation 2. This pairing would make thematic sense, as remoras are small fish that attach themselves to larger marine animals, like manta rays, in a symbiotic relationship, cleaning parasites from the host's skin while gaining protection and transportation. The Pokédex even acknowledges this relationship, stating that Remoraid often attach themselves to Mantine's fins, and the games allow Mantine to be found with Remoraid attached in certain locations. If Remoraid evolved directly into Mantine, it would represent one of the few instances where Pokemon evolution reflects a real biological relationship rather than generic growth or metamorphosis. The gun-like appearance of Remoraid could be retained in Mantine's design through fin shapes or body proportions that echo the cylindrical, angular aesthetic of its pre-evolution. For Octillery, the theory suggests it was originally designed as the evolution of a different water-type Pokemon, possibly one that was cut during development or that remains lost in the game's data files. The octopus's design includes several features that don't connect to Remoraid, but might make sense as developments from a different starting point, a pre-evolution with a rounder body shape, tentacle-like protrusions, or coloration that would flow more naturally into Octillery's red and yellow scheme. The theory acknowledges that no such pre-evolution has been found or confirmed, but points to the large number of cut Pokemon from Gold and Silver's development as evidence that many designs went through radical changes or were abandoned entirely. Perhaps Octillery's intended pre-evolution was cut late in development, and rather than also removing Octillery, designers simply connected it to Remoraid as a temporary solution that became permanent. The actual design inspiration for the Remoraid Octillery evolution provides an alternative, though arguably stranger, explanation. Both Pokemon are based on firearms. Remoraid takes its design from a pistol or revolver, while Octillery is based on artillery, specifically a tank or cannon. The evolution represents an upgrade in firepower, moving from a handheld gun to heavy artillery, with the octopus form allowing multiple tentacles to function in as gun barrels. This thematic connection exists entirely outside the realm of biology and makes sense only when viewed through the lens of mechanical design rather than animal morphology. It explains why the two Pokemon look so different while sharing a conceptual link, but it also feels like the kind of obscure design joke that makes perfect sense to the creators while completely mystifying players who expect an evolution to follow some kind of biological logic. Critics of the swapped evolution theory note that many Pokemon evolution chains involve dramatic visual shifts that don't seem to follow logical progression. Dragonair's beautiful serpentine form evolving into Dragonite's dumpy orange dragon body confounds players to this day, yet this didn't result from a development error, but rather reflects how different designers worked on different evolutionary stages without perfect coordination. Magikarp's transformation into Gyarados represents one of the most extreme evolutions in the series, moving from pathetic fish to fearsome sea serpent, proving that Game Freak has always been comfortable with metamorphic changes that defy gradual transformation expectations. The Remoraid Octillery evolution, while unusual, fits within established patterns of Pokemon evolution, sometimes prioritizing thematic or conceptual connections over visual continuity. Yet the theory persists because it attempts to impose biological logic onto a universe that often prioritizes other considerations. The unsatisfying nature of the official explanation that one gun evolves into a bigger gun despite both being disguised as sea creatures leaves many players feeling that something went wrong during development, even if no evidence supports that conclusion. The theory demonstrates how audiences expect certain kinds of consistency from fictional universes and become troubled when those expectations aren't met, prompting searches for explanations that restore the desired coherence. Whether Remoraid and Octillery represent a design swap, a last minute pairing of unrelated concepts, or simply an evolution chain that values thematic consistency over visual progression, their relationship remains one of the stranger examples of Pokemon's sometimes inscrutable design philosophy. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we encounter theories about the true nature of legendary Pokemon and their relationship to the creation myths scattered throughout the games. Generation 4 introduced Arceus, described in Pokédex entries and in-game legends as the creator of the Pokemon universe, a deity-like being that emerged from an egg in the void before the universe existed and then shaped space, time, and antimatter through the creation of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. This cosmic mythology positions Arceus as essentially God within the Pokemon world, an omnipotent being responsible for all of existence. However, the theory that has emerged around Arceus questions whether this legendary really is the true creator god, or whether it is simply an extremely powerful Pokemon that ancient humans mistook for a deity. The theory points to several inconsistencies in Arceus's mythology that undermine its claim to absolute godhood. Most significantly, Arceus can be caught and commanded by a 10-year-old with a Pokeball, hardly befitting a being that predates the universe and created existence itself. While one could argue that Arceus allows itself to be caught as part of some divine plan or test, This explanation feels like rationalization rather than something supported by the narrative. Additionally, Arceus has base stats that, while impressive, are not overwhelmingly beyond other legendary Pokemon, sitting at 680 compared to Mewtwo's 680 or Rayquaza's 680. For the literal creator of the universe, being merely competitive with other legendary Pokemon in combat seems underwhelming, suggesting that Arceus might be extraordinarily powerful but not truly omnipotent. The theory proposes that Arceus is actually just an ancient, extremely powerful legendary Pokemon that happened to exist near the beginning of human civilization in the Sinnoh region. When early humans encountered this majestic, seemingly all powerful creature, they naturally incorporated it into their creation stories, attributing to it the origin of the universe itself. As these legends were passed down through generations, the distinction between a very powerful Pokemon that ancient people worshipped and the actual creator of all existence became blurred until the mythology solidified into the version players encounter in the modern games. This interpretation frames legendary Pokemon mythology as what it likely is in our world, stories humans tell to explain phenomena they don't fully understand, with powerful beings elevated to divine status through cultural repetition and embellishment. This reading gains support from the way different regions have completely different creation myths featuring different legendary Pokemon as central figures. Hoenn's legends center on Groudon and Kyogre shaping the land and sea. Alola's myths revolve around the guardian deities and legendary protectors. Galar's history involves Eternatus and the Darkest Day. Each region's legendaries receive mythological significance within their local cultures while being largely unknown or dismissed as fantasy elsewhere. If Arceus truly created the universe, one would expect its worship and recognition to be universal, yet characters from other regions treat Arceus legends as regional mythology rather than accepted cosmological fact. This suggests that each region's legendary Pokemon achieve godlike status within their local cultures without necessarily representing universal truths about the nature of reality. Skeptics of this theory argue that the Pokemon games operate on multiple levels, simultaneously, serving both as gameplay experiences where you can catch and battle powerful creatures, and as narrative experiences where those same creatures hold cosmic significance. The ability to catch Arceus in a Pokeball represents a gameplay necessity and player reward rather than evidence against its divine status, similar to how players can catch other clearly powerful entities that logically shouldn't be capturable. The game designers want players to be able to use legendary Pokemon on their teams because they're cool and powerful, so they make them catchable, despite the narrative awkwardness this creates. Taking gameplay mechanics as evidence for or against lore claims leads to absurd conclusions, like arguing that Pokemon can't actually die because they only faint in battle, or that humans must be superhumanly durable because trainers regularly stand next to Pokemon using abilities like Earthquake or Lava Plume. Yet the theory resonates because it acknowledges the strange contradiction at the heart of legendary Pokemon design. They are simultaneously portrayed as unique, world shaping entities of cosmic significance and as collectible creatures that players can catch, trade, and use in competitive battles. This tension exists throughout the series and becomes particularly pronounced with Arceus, whose mythology strains against the mechanical reality of what Pokemon games allow players to do. The theory provides a framework for resolving this tension by suggesting that the mythology itself is unreliable narrator, that the legends are exactly that, legends, stories that contain some truth but also considerable exaggeration and cultural projection. Whether Arceus really is God or just an extremely powerful Pokemon that ancient people mistook for God, The theory highlights how Pokemon's lore exists in constant negotiation with its gameplay, each pulling the narrative in different directions while somehow maintaining coherence. Before we continue deeper into these facts, let's consider another theory that examines the relationship between humans and Pokemon in the distant past. The theory proposes that humans and Pokemon were once the same species, and that modern humans represent an evolutionary branch that lost its powers, while Pokemon represent the branches that retained or developed supernatural abilities. This hypothesis attempts to explain the deep connections between humans and Pokemon, why they can understand each other despite language barriers, why humans seem uniquely capable of bonding with and commanding Pokemon, and why certain myths and Pokédex entries hint at past relationships that blur the species boundary. The primary evidence for this theory comes from Sinnoh mythology, recorded in the Canalave Library, specifically the book that states, "There once were Pokemon that became very close to humans," and "There once were Pokemon that married people." These lines suggest a time when the distinction between human and Pokemon was less absolute than in the modern era, when relationships we would now consider impossible were normal and accepted. Other Pokedex entries reinforce this sense of permeability between species. Kadabra's entry mentions rumors that a boy with psychic powers woke up one morning transformed into Kadabra. Phantump is said to be the spirit of children who died in the forest. Yamask explicitly carries a mask that was its human face. All of these examples point toward a world where transformation between human and Pokemon forms occurs or has occurred. If humans and Pokemon share a common ancestor, it would explain why humans alone, among Earth's animals, developed technology and civilization, while Pokemon developed supernatural abilities. Both represent different solutions to the problem of survival and adaptation. Humans chose tool use, communication, and social organization to overcome their physical limitations, while Pokemon developed intrinsic abilities like elemental control, flight without anatomical wings, and various forms of energy manipulation. This divergence might have occurred millions of years ago, or it might be more recent, with humans representing the Pokemon that chose to suppress or lose their powers in exchange for other advantages. The theory sometimes extends to suggest that modern psychics, aura users, and other humans with supernatural abilities represent throwbacks to this common ancestor, individuals in whom the dormant powers occasionally resurface. The way Pokeballs work lends strange support to this interpretation. Pokeballs can catch and contain Pokemon, but have no effect on humans, despite humans being biological organisms that should theoretically be susceptible to the same space compression technology. Unless Pokeballs are programmed to specifically not work on humans, this suggests they operate by recognizing something fundamental about Pokemon biology and responding only to